Wildlife Recovery Board's YouTube channel soon. My name is Merritt Mitchell, Outreach and Communications Manager with Mid-Columbia Fisheries Enhancement Group. I also want to welcome and acknowledge all of our representatives presenting and in the room today from tribal, nonprofit, private, public sector sections. And if you have the opportunity, please mute your microphone. I'm getting a little background noise here. Thank you all for your enthusiasm for riparian restoration and contributions to the stewardship of Eastern Washington and beyond. So we did a fun little exercise where we shared, and thanks to Kira Pinkerton, who is our Washington Conservation Corps individual placement for doing this today. We have one of our staff, and we'll introduce other staff here in a minute, but we took the opportunity to see where everybody registered from when we did our Eventbrite. And today we have registered over 193 people. I was wondering why someone in Tennessee would be registering, but then I assumed it was just where that person was when they registered. So unless there is anyone from Tennessee here, you can put it in the chat if you are. But we really are covering a lot of ground with our registration. I am presenting today as the committee chair for Populus, the Columbia Basin Riparian Planting Partnership. The Populus Committee is responsible for organizing this symposium, as well as field trips and webinars we are going to be offering later this spring and summer. Hopefully you'll have those on your agenda. The newsletter that is sent out and the various other training and site tours throughout the year. Populus receives a tremendous amount of financial and on-the-ground support from our wonderful committee that consists of the Washington State Department of Ecology, Mid-Columbia Fisheries Enhancement Group, who I am with, the Yakima Basin Fish and Wildlife Recovery Board, the Palouse Conservation District, and Kuskookee Commons in Walla Walla. I'd like to invite our committee to turn on your cameras and let everybody see who you are, if you have a moment to do that, and recognize the hard work they put into making this event happen and their dedication and to riparian restoration in general. But please, everybody, give me a round of applause for our committee members. We would also like to invite any board members from any of our committee organizations to also be acknowledged. I believe we may have board members from Mid-Columbia Fisheries here today. Not sure if we have any others. I haven't checked the waiting room. But again, please join me in giving them a round of applause. And then, not to be outdone, but we are really wanting to express gratitude to this year's sponsors of the 2025 Symposium. When we pivoted, they pivoted with us. And as the symposium has continued to grow, we depend on these sponsorships to make this event happen. I would like to extend a huge thanks to the following organizations for their generous donations, which allowed today's symposium to happen this year and then beyond. Hopefully we'll return to in-person next year. So Wakefield Excavation, BFI Native, Snake River Salmon Recovery Board, Plants of the Wild Native Plant Nursery, GG Environmental, Washington Native Plant Society, Tetra Tech, Anabranch Solutions, Plateau CRM, Yakima Basin Fish and Wildlife Recovery Board, and Wildlands Incorporated. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Turn on your cameras if you represent these organizations as well. So today's agenda, the link to the symposium booklet will be in the chat, so you can follow along, but this is what we're looking at today, and I need to quickly stop talking so I can turn it over to Alex Connolly, our first speaker. We do have one schedule break today. It's a slight variation from some of the earlier schedules sent out. Made the decision that maybe everybody might want a bathroom break. The link to the speaker booklet, again, is available in the chat. Please keep your microphones off until the Q&A sessions. Each of our presenters will have Q&A built into the end of their presentations. And as you are thinking of your questions, don't hesitate to throw them in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat as you think of them. Also, please use the hand raise feature on the bottom of your toolbar to ask a question once we move into the Q&A sessions. And now we're going to meet our presenters for the day as we transition. And I'm going to turn this over to Tori Wood. Tori, would you please introduce yourself really quickly before you introduce Alex?
So my name is Tori Wood. I work with Mid-Columbia Fisheries, and I'm also on the committee of Populus. And I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Alex Conley. Alex is the Executive Director of the Yakima Basin Fish and Wildlife Recovery Board. The Recovery Board brings local and tribal governments in the Yakima Basin together to recover at-risk fish and wildlife in the Yakima Basin, with an emphasis on federally listed steelhead and bull trout. Alex will present the role of riparian restoration and salmon recovery, the diverse state and federal programs available to support it, and the current policy discussions about how we could better protect and restore riparian areas in the future. He will emphasize the need for practitioners on the ground to actively help shape funding programs that can help them effectively and efficiently restore riparian areas. And then please do hold your questions until the end of all of our presenters, and help me join Alex Conley.
Okay. So I didn't know if you were presenting everyone or just me at this point. Do you want me to jump in?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, welcome all. And yeah, I have to pick which screen to look at here. Before I pull up my presentation, Merritt, you are muted.
I was just going to say, pull up your presentation. We don't have it. So,
Yep, no, I said, but before I pull it up, I just want to say, I think some of us were here in 2017. Were we there in person? Like I all know we wish we were. I'd be asking to raise hands who had made that first populist symposium. We didn't know then if it'd be more than a 1 year off, one-time thing. And it's pretty great to be here 8 years later and still a huge amount of interest. A lot of people registered, a lot of good events laid out. The only unfortunate thing is being here virtually rather than in person for different reasons than before. Though I did have COVID 2 weeks ago, we're really virtually this year because of the state budget crises. And just want to emphasize that it's great to see this community growing. And it's really fun to be able to jump in. I'm going to share a few thoughts on riparian restoration programs, projects, and policies. And I also want to have a little bit of time to be able to jump in and see anything that's on your mind that you want to highlight, especially on the policy front. So I am. Can you now see my slide there for you? All right. I was thinking I might try and do this presentation without PowerPoint so that you're not just staring at a static slide and you'd have to look at my mug. Then I realized how hard it is anymore, how used we've gotten to having slides to kick off what the next thing we were going to say is. So I do have some slides, but I kept it really simple. And I'm going to admit that lately I've been feeling a little worn out. I don't know if anyone else can relate, but it's been a long several years. Part of it is great. It's success. We've got so much going on, but sometimes it feels like we're just juggling more and more balls. And then in the last little while, yeah, I think many can relate that as we send in bills and have them bounce back and wonder what projects are going to be able to come back online when, it's been a strange time, and I'm probably not alone in having felt a little bit worn out. I just want to recognize that. I want to say it's normal. We're all trying to figure out our way forward in a complicated bureaucratic environment. And I also want to I'll start my presentation by going to a time where I felt maybe a little more upbeat and free. Yep, we're talking about 1972. So jumping back to the 70s, it was a great time to be a kid. I can still smell the cut grass, the freedom, the lack of 3 monitors facing me every day. But I don't want to talk about the 70s because of me. I just want to remind us how quickly the world has changed. You know, this photo's the year after the passage of the Clean Water Act. Fish and game departments were still busy clearing and straightening out streams. I think we probably hit the point where almost everyone's retired, but not that many years ago, I met a lot of people in the restoration business who started their job being hired by a fisheries program to clear streams. You know, back when I was a kid, we were still in the tail end of the belief that dilution is the solution for pollution. You know, and that included medical waste, where I grew up being dumped offshore and washing up on the beaches. So I just wanted to pull this up and say how much has changed in a single lifetime. You know, we've seen tremendous growth in some areas. Other areas, we've seen rural communities collapse and farms melt back into the woods. We've really changed how we've used the land over these 50 years. We've and then over the course of the 70s and 80s, we saw the growth of the environmental movement, new laws and government programs to protect streams, wetlands, and riparian areas, and really, in many ways, the beginning of the work we do. There's antecedents going back much further, but really to see a large-scale effort to try and restore streams and riparian areas, you're talking the 80s into the 90s. So now I'm going to jump ahead one generation. This is 1999. This is my daughter. I couldn't help myself. Just thinking of lifetimes and how quickly they pass and how short history is. And so when she was this age in 1999, we had the listing of salmon and steelhead in the Pacific Northwest, and that precipitated a wave of crisis and a robust creative response by state, local, and federal folks. Really, the creation of the policy world we work in now and the growth of the restoration business we're all a part of. So some of you may have been around back around 99 and remember the sense both of crisis, but also of possibility, the creativity that came with people from state, federal, and local entities coming together and saying, how are we going to get this done? How do we lay out a 25-year path? And one of the best records of that for me, and my apologies that this is a Washington bias talk, I'm impressed how many people we have from a much broader region, but there are parallels, I think, in the other states of the region. 1999, we saw the first statewide strategy to recover salmon. Extinction is not an option. Some of you know this document, some don't. It's actually an amazingly well thought out document that still is one of the better roadmaps of all the different restoration programs, the needs for salmon, and how we can bring them all together across diverse government and non-governmental entities. So to me, it really marks a turning point. And when I went back to it and said, all right, what are our main strategies for riparian restoration that we laid out 25 years ago? Those top two, the Forest and Fish updates to the Forest Practices Act and ESA protections for federal riparian buffers, these made a huge change in how riparian areas in forested areas were managed. Really a sea change from when I was riding that motorcycle around. It was still totally normal to drive your skidder right up the creek and to log right through all the riparian areas. That's really changed. We can have a discussion about whether more work is needed to protect forested riparian areas, but man, that's a sea change in 25 years on that piece of the landscape. The statewide strategy also really emphasized the need for land management, land use programs to protect riparian areas. And for those of us in Washington, that really means the Shorelines Management Act in critical areas. It's a whole nother presentation of how we're doing on that. I'd love to have that with this group and specific to especially to the interior Columbia Basin, but that's not today's discussion. So jump down, what did it envision as really the drivers on the ground of riparian restoration? It was all about the CREP program, a federal state partnership with USDA to provide landowners with incentive payments to put 15-year leases on streamside areas and replant them. It was all about implementation of the Clean Water Act and TMDLs, that we were going to use the mix of federal and state funding unleashed through the Clean Water Act, and we were going to use TMDLs to say where we had water quality problems and how riparian restoration was part of the solution. And the statewide strategy is really emphasize the need for watershed and recovery plans created at local and regional scales, and then robust funding for their implementation. So 5 years ago, this is what we said we needed. And I'm just going to do a real quick review of where we've gone since then. So the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program was really a piece of what we thought we'd do 25 years ago. And if you were in the room, I'd ask people who've worked with it to raise your hands. When you look at this map, you can see that down in the southeast corner of the state around Walla Walla, it's been used really heavily. And up in the northwest corner of the state around the Skagit and up through Whatcom County, it's been used really heavily, moderately through other parts of Western Washington. But really, in Eastern Washington, except that southeastern corner, CREP never really became the engine for riparian restoration it was hoped it would. And there's a lot of different reasons where the land payment's not high enough. Was it that the bureaucratic structures weren't in place to create the focus on it? we could have another whole presentation just on what's made CREP not the tool we thought it was when we set out the strategy. But even when you look statewide, and I've grabbed these maps and figures from the 22 effectiveness report by the Conservation Commission, we've enrolled a lot of land in CREP. Land has started coming out of CREP as well. And you can see the net acreage has actually been declining over time. And this was before the audit issues that actually started canceling many CREP projects and have created a real crisis for the program. Many of you are navigating this, especially again for this audience in the Walla Walla area. But we saw audits say that many of the leases were entered into even though they should not have been eligible, and people's contracts have either been modified or ended. So CREP was envisioned as a huge tool. It's worked well in some places. It's done a lot of great work on the ground, but it's not the engine of riparian restoration in interior Washington that we would hope it be. Another big program we talked about a lot back in 25 years ago is Clean Water Act implementation. You know, that Clean Water Act passed when I was riding that motorcycle around under the sprinkler. It created a whole mechanism to identify water quality problems, plan their solutions through TMDL plans, and provide funding through the federal 319 funds, through state funds to fix those problems. And this was really, again, a programmatic vision for how we were going to deal with issues like temperature and solutions to it, like riparian restoration. And this is all areas that are either on the 303D list or have TMDL plans in Washington. We did a ton of work, but it's really piecemeal. If you look at the streams, we don't have continuous coverage and continuous TMDL plans that have become the engine of our restoration. We have some great technical work. We have some good areas where we do focus on because of the TMDLs, but it never quite became the programmatic engine we thought. And I could go through a few other programs. This is a quick presentation. I won't dive into it. But what we do have, and the thing that really we have run with that has developed maybe much more so than folks envisioned back when they were writing the statewide strategy, are voluntary grant programs. So again, apologies for the Washington-centric nation, but for us, that's surfboard grants. For those from Oregon, OWEB grants. It's the Department of Ecology's water quality grant programs, whether that's federal funds that are passed through the state or state funds. We've got quite a few grant programs in water quality. We have the new Streamflow grant program. We have Conservation Commission funds, and recently the Riparian grant program. Just in the last 2 years, we have new RCO riparian grants. We have been not as successful at building really robust programs. We've been really successful at creating grant funding streams for individual projects. So let's go forward. This is that toddler this year. Another 25 years have passed, another generation. And where are we? So 40 years of history and learning and a lot of great work. We have done a lot of work. We have learned, we have some incredible success stories, but we also have to face the fact that survival monitoring has shown really mixed results from riparian. At its best, we've had really successful plantings that have really created the ecological outcomes we've hoped for. At our worst, we've seen scattershot, often after the fact, investment in throwing plants around a different kind of a project or efforts to plant in areas that may not have been well chosen that have struggled. We have seen project-based approaches more than we've seen broader programs. And what do I mean by that? Many of you in the audience are doing riparian work, and you pick a site, and then you start writing grants, often multiple grants for a single site. Multiple grants, each which requires an application, each which requires a different set of requirements, different set of timelines. And then if you want to work on the next 10 acres over, and you only learn that 6 months after you start the first project, you start a new set of grants. So we've had a lot of funding available. We've done well with that approach, but it places a high burden on us for managing contracts, for grant applications, and it also makes it hard for us to show cumulative benefits. You can show the benefits of this project, this 5 acres, that 10 acres, but it's prone to the accusation that at a landscape scale, it's more scattered, or that each individual project doesn't get you to the cusp where you can really say, here's how we've gotten the environmental outcomes we hope for. So I think the project-based approach has been great in that we're doing a lot of work, but I think it's created a lot of challenges for us too. The other thing that we see with riparian work is a lot of tension over standards. You know, do we need to set specific buffered standards, and how? How rigorous should we be? When are we so rigorous that it makes harder for those of you on the ground to get a landowner to sign the dotted line? When do we scare a landowner away with our 400-page handbook? And when do we need those to help us make sure we get the successes? Just attention. I'm not going to try and resolve it right here. When we've also got questions about costs and competing approaches. Sometimes we can do a great restoration program that changes the hydrology and natural regen kicks in. Cost $0 per plant. Awesome when we can do it, but it doesn't work anywhere. The site next door, you may have a hard soils to work with, a weed problem, strong presence of beavers and elk herd that comes through in winter, and all of a sudden by the time you've done soil prep, deep planting, fencing, you can be looking at $100,000 an acre for riparian restoration. Both are legitimate. They're different sites, different needs. The challenge is, how do we talk at a policy level about what we need to do and how that varies across sites? So those are some of the challenges we've got right now. We've had a few new developments in the last 2 years. A strong sense politically that we need to do more, we need to do it faster, we need to do it better. And that's both exciting and challenging. In Washington State, we've had a big infusion of new funding for riparian areas, two $25 million biennium grants programs through the RCO and the conservation districts, new funding programs through ecology. We've had lots of political interest in helping us go bigger and faster. That's generated the new funding, but it's also generated a lot of questions about, are we doing what we need to protect riparian areas? How do we set up the riparian restoration programs to ensure the successes? How do we build programs instead of having to write 4 grants for each 5 acres? How do we get a program going where you can actually put a contract in place with a grower to have plant materials, where you can actually schedule a season's work for a crew rather than billing them across 50 different individual sites? We've got a lot of great projects hitting the ground. It's a great time to be in this business. And I know from talking to folks, capacity stretched thin. We're trying to do more with the same people. We're trying to do more even as some of the bureaucratic challenges have increased. So, know that you're not alone if you're feeling stretched thin, and know that in some ways it has been the price of a lot of good success, but it's not something that's sustainable for the long haul. We have got to shift things a little. In Washington State, we've seen a lot of discussion at a high policy level about riparian policy. How do we update land use programs to better protect riparian areas? How do we accelerate the pace of riparian restoration activities like folks here are engaged in? It's been both a great discussion and a challenging discussion. Great because I think there's strong consensus on high-level needs, and challenging because we haven't yet gotten to the point where there's broad agreement on here are the specific programs and policy changes that could be brought to the legislature that would really up our game. So many of you have been involved in this in detail. When I originally planned this talk, I thought that this might have generated more legislative proposals this year. And also I had thought that we would already have seen the budgets. Those are just coming out the next 2 weeks. So I don't have anything to report on specific legislative actions in Washington. I do want to just highlight that there is a lot of room for in the next 2 years to queue up big legislative approaches on riparian policy. And with that in mind, I want to highlight what I see as the key needs for a group like this. One of them, we've got to show strategic planning at a local level. Like we noted, we've fallen into a project-based approach. The larger programs that we established 25 years ago in many ways have struggled to be able to show the cumulative benefits at a program level. So we've got to show it at a local level. We've got to show why we're working where, what changes we're trying to do, and how the work we're doing adds up over time. It's extra work, and we're already writing multiple grants for each of those projects, but it's needed work. So I just want to really encourage people to lean into that strategic planning at a local level, where you guys actually understand what's going to be needed to accelerate riparian restoration and show its cumulative benefits. The second thing I think we're doing right here, right now, and that's building a strong community of practice. It is utterly critical that we share both what works and what doesn't work, that people with experience have an opportunity to help um, carry that knowledge to newer people in the field, that we ask the hard questions of each other. So yeah, join in these populist events. Ask people for advice, challenge projects you think could be done better. It's part of making sure we do our work well. The other half of it is to really carefully match best practices to the site. And that I'll let other presenters talk about that today. But I think one of the key things is, remember when I said sometimes you can do riparian restoration for free if you can kick regen into action. Other times it's 100,000 an acre. Why is that? How do we read the sites to get the right budget, the right techniques all matched up? And then four, I really want to encourage you guys to engage in these policy discussions. We're stretched thin, we're juggling all these projects, but if we're not talking about what's going to support us and help us build capacity and reduce overhead while we go bigger, better, faster, it's not going to happen. The folks at the higher policy level don't understand things the way that everyone working on the ground does. We need to be hearing from you as people are talking about riparian policies at the state level, talking about legislative packages, talking about agency guidelines, talking about grant policy requirements. So engage. And then finally, yeah, let's celebrate the successes. There's awesome work out there, and also face the challenges head on. We can do better. Both are true. Grab those, run with them, celebrate the work you're doing, and yeah, just want to encourage this group to charge on. I don't know if there's time for a question or two. I'm available anytime today or otherwise. If people have specific thoughts on how they think we should be building programs that can support our work and reduce the capacity burden, I'd love to hear that. I think that the next year is going to be one of those windows that only comes along every decade or so, where we really have the chance to define what kinds of programs we could build that are resilient, robust, reduce the capacity costs, and help us pick up the pace and scale on the ground. So I'll end there and yeah, leave it to Merritt to say if
We
we have
have
some.
one minute for questions. So if there's any burning questions, we might have some time at the end. We could also put them in the chat. Well, it seems like none. Thank you, Alex. Fantastic conversation, and I'm hoping that people will be reaching out. Let me share my screen. I have the pleasure of introducing Reed Camp. And I'm very excited to hear his presentation as well. Reed is a fluvial geomorphologist specializing in watershed assessments, river restoration design, and effectiveness monitoring. He spent 15 years as a consultant leading projects throughout the Northwest and recently joined the Snake River Salmon Recovery Board as their science and technical coordinator. Reed is also president of River Restoration Northwest, a nonprofit that brings restoration practitioners together to share knowledge and experience. Reed and his wife, Megan, live in Moscow, Idaho with their two rabbits, Banjo and Chloe, and their beloved dog, River. And he also will be leading a field trip for us on May 2nd in the Palouse region. So I'm going to stop presenting and Reed, take it away.
Hello. Okay. I just sent you an email, Merritt. My Zoom keeps crashing, so hopefully this all works out fine. But I think it's going to be okay. Might be a screen share issue. I'll
Okay,
go ahead and just share this.
I'll be prepared.
All right. Everybody see that? Okay. Well, thanks everybody. I'm glad to be here. Even though this is a presentation on, or a symposium on riparian restoration, it's very important to understand how rivers operate because, as you'll see, riparian restoration co-evolved with the way rivers behave and way they flood and function. what we're going to cover today. I'm going to go over a brief background of fluvial processes and how rivers operate, put that in the context of rivers themselves, the channels, the floodplains, and the riparian area, because that's where it all comes home for the purpose of this symposium. And then I want to highlight some planning resources that I like to use when I'm thinking about river restoration and how it coincides with riparian planning and integrating channel restoration, whether that's structures or channel modifications, whatever, how you can incorporate better riparian planting projects into your restoration. And we do have a site visit as part of this on May 2nd out on Rose and 4 Mile Creeks, hosted by Palouse Conservation District. So I hope you guys can join us there. But I am going to use some of those resources as examples from the Rose and 4 Mile Creeks so that you have a little context if you join us in the field of taking that digital environment, what you can see in the computer to on the ground. But first, we're going to take a big step back, go back to grade school, and talk about a little bit about the hydrologic cycle, because this all starts the way rivers form. They're interacting with the hydraulic environment, and so we need to know where water's coming from. So briefly, just thinking about this, this should bring back some memories. But there's sort of a finite amount of water in the world, locally and across the globe, and basically, water is out in the oceans or out in standing water, rivers, ponds, lakes, whatever, and it evaporates because of the heating sun, gets taken up by vegetation and exposed as transpiration. It all goes up into the atmosphere, condenses, rains down or snows down, and repeats that cycle, melts off, and enters our surface water areas. And so we can see this, and we can know pretty well what's going on with all of this. But for riparian restoration and riparian plantings in general, there's all this other interaction below the surface that we don't know as much about, or it's really hard to model, really hard to graph. But that's where the roots of plants need to be, right? So this whole groundwater interaction and hyporheic exchange beneath the surface along the channels and along the boundaries of channels and in the floodplains. And another way of looking at this, just kind of taking a cross-section view of the hydrologic cycle, all those big things, water going up and coming down, is over here on the left. But that all, of course, ends up into what we are concerned about, those riparian corridors as surface flow in a stream channel. And the important purpose of this, to know this, is that elevation of the stream channel of where the water is pretty close in most cases to the water table. And those riparian plantings need to get their feet wet so they can reach that water table. But this is also, like I said, it's hard to understand. It's really hard to know exactly what's going on because there are a lot of differences, even within a relatively short reach of a river, of gaining and losing water within that interchange between the groundwater table and the surface flow. So you might have gaining reaches where the pressure of the water table is a little higher. Maybe this is related to soils or geology or even incoming ephemeral tributaries or springs and seeps that are pushing more pressure and that into the water table, and that it gets exposed into the stream. So you might have a little more water on the surface than other areas. But just the same, you can have losing reaches where the pressure is the opposite. Water is literally being sucked out of the surface flow and brought down into the water table. And in some cases, not just losing water, but also be fully disconnected from that surface flow in the water table. And this is the types of areas that you'll often see go dry or subsurface in the late summer months. But this is important. Again, the big take home is that water table is going to be close to the elevation of the stream channel. And we'll return to the water table a little bit here in a few minutes. But when my background is in fluvial geomorphology, and what we often are concerned with or focusing on is the surface flow or runoff. In these big flood events, that's where a lot of the geomorphic action occurs. And so that's how we can kind of predict where rivers have been, where they are now, and where they're going. And that is the study of fluvial geomorphology. That's the study of river form and function, but particularly it's that interaction between flowing water and the landscapes that they're flowing over. We talk about this a lot in the terms of erosion, where the sediment is actually taken away or removed through hydraulic action, deposition, where, for lack of a better word, sediment is deposited, it's dropped out and left on the landscape in big piles or small piles. And then the literal transport, the active movement of that sediment through the water. And this is exactly how rivers create the features that are around them on the floodplain and along their channel. And maybe it's a little confusing sometimes. You think that rocks can move because they're heavy, but water is a powerful source. And every rock, every particle, even up boulders, cobble, gravel, down to little tiny sands and silts, are all experiencing these same forces as the water's flowing over them. And we can simplify this into just movement forces and resistance forces. When the movement forces overcome the resistance forces, then you have what's called entrainment, or this is the mobilization of sediment. And if we just take the simplified cross section of a stream bed here, got flow moving from left to right. Water velocities tend to be lower on the bottom and higher at the top. But as that water is moving through, you have drag trying to push an individual rock downstream. You also have lift, which is the buoyance action. Like things in water are lighter than they are in air. And so the buoyance effect is trying to lift that rock upward. But this is in direct counter action to gravity, the force of gravity pulling that rock down against the surface of the stream bed, and the friction as that rock is sliding against other rocks. And this is happening all across all the different sizes, right? And so the other terms that are good to know, we have bed load, which is going to be the larger rocks, and those kind of tumble along the bottom of the bed. And they're also the main kind of driving force for morphological features along the stream bed. They're harder to move, they take bigger floods to move, and so they tend to pile up in mounds or features that can lead to further changes down the line. Smaller stuff, not quite down to sands and fines, can bounce along the bottom. So they're not just directly tumbling. It's called saltation, where they can kind of be lifted up a little bit and then bounce and kind of bounce their way down. It's a little more rare and typically in places with a big, wide range of sediment sizes and occurring over larger floods. And then the suspension, it's going to be mainly your sands and your silts. This is the kind of stuff that we want to care about for not just ecological disturbance. We don't want to have too many fines in our rivers, but this is also the type of material that when it falls out is prime planting locations. And natural riparian species, when they're dispersing their seeds, are going to be looking for areas of this type of fine sediment out on the floodplain or on the channel margins. Dissolved sediment is mainly more of an issue potentially with water quality issues. This is going to be actually the individual ions, isotopes, molecules that are broken off or weathered, chemically weathered from rocks, and it's actually dissolved in suspension within the water column. So as the rocks are moving down through all this, that is exactly how these rivers are creating the landscape around them. So over time, over millennia, potentially even millions of years, these rivers have been kind of snaking their way across the landscape, eroding the channel margins, creating flat surfaces and flooding, and creating all kinds of dynamic habitat out on the floodplain, and can look very different year to year. You saw as that was snaking across. Sometimes the river was straight, sometimes it was meandering, sometimes it was on the valley wall, sometimes it wasn't. But as it's navigating across there, it's making all these different features on the landscape. You think of meandering rivers, those often will create oxbow lakes or scars. As the active channel is there, that they might be eroding a bank, creating an undercut or a cut bank and depositing bars. But again, this is occurring over many, every flood event, this is happening. It can happen slow or it can happen fast. But then when there's some type of disturbance event, whether it's natural or human caused, in this case, they're replicating geologic uplift that reset the grade. And so the river has to do that all again and create a new floodplain surface. And again, creating, as it does that, all those different features out in the landscape. This is important for riparian because those tend to be depressions in the landscape that can bring that ground surface elevation closer to the water table, making them prime locations for riparian plantings. This also should be the areas that if the land wasn't cultivated or heavily developed, where you would see pockets of water leveling vegetation established, even if the other areas are maybe more upland vegetation or drier vegetation. And we see these terraces start forming old floodplain areas. These areas are now abandoned, right? The river has dropped down far enough that the water table is too far away, and those are going to be upland species. And all the riparian zone is going to be just restricted to the more modern area that the river has recently developed. And the reason this is important, again, coming back to riparian vegetation, riparian vegetation co-evolved with the way rivers function, and the way they behave. So it's that dynamism, that active change year to year, decade to decade, that is allowing riparian succession to occur. And this paper does a really great job over this it's a 40, 50-year period, looking at the river, this Allier River in France, of how it changed. So the river's in blue, and it's avulsed a couple times. It's abandoned oxbows, and it's recaptured those oxbows through the decades and moved around. But notice the legend down here where you have bare soil, the pioneer species, and going into herb and shrub and forest. As the river abandons those areas, yeah, maybe is left with bare soil for a little bit, but that's that fine sediment that has nutrients in it from previous floods. It's areas that are depressions in the landscape that are a little closer to the water table, even if the main channel has abandoned it. And so pioneer species, those nitrogen fixers like alder, they're going to come in almost immediately. Also, unfortunately, sometimes invasive species come in immediately, but they come in, they attach themselves to those bare soils and initiate the next successional phases as sediment composition improves and as they get more flooding. So herbs will start coming in, shrubs will come in, and then finally forests. If the area is left alone long enough, the forest stands can start coming back. And so it's not just that the active succession that's occurring because of the rivers as they move, but those old flood paths and the flooding itself. The flooding obviously provides immediate water when the water goes out there, but those flow paths, even if they get covered with topsoil or flood deposits, there's still alluvium down there that can capture underground flow that you're not seeing. That hyporheic zone, that groundwater zone, is pushing water through. So there can be really great places for riparian to thrive or even to target for riparian planting projects. And those floods also bring deposits of those soft, fine soils so that you can have future areas for natural seed deposits to fall out. And of course, many species just evolve to with the rivers where their seeds need to be dispersed through those flood events. Like cottonwood, water, the seeds, those little fluff balls like to land on the water, get pushed out, and they follow and get caught in eddies and slow water zones where fine sediment deposits. But as that flood recedes, the seeds also deposit.
Oh, you're muted. Would you like me to
Back on.
share? Yeah, you're
Uh,
back.
no,
Want to
it,
try?
I'm gonna bring it back up because the whole WebEx is or whole Zoom is dropping. All right, did I leave off here?
I believe so.
Okay. So these rivers, they're trying to expend as little energy as possible. And they can do this by, which is shown in this conceptual model, they can do this by balancing four primary inputs. They have their sediment load, the amount of sediment that's coming into the system, the size of that sediment that's in there, and then the bed slope or gradient and the water discharge. And so if you just envision here, for example, if you increase the amount of water coming into the system, that's going to drop this bucket down, make this scale tip to the right, and push this arrow over towards degradation or incision or erosion. And just the same, maybe there's a landslide or somebody dumps a ton of gravel or something into the river. That's going to increase the amount of bed material that's in there. It's going to tip the scale the opposite way and move this arrow towards aggradation. And these rivers, of course, they're trying to just keep reduce the amount of energy they're expending so they're not doing too much erosion, not doing too much deposition, or that they're at least sort of balanced. Whatever gets eroded from one area is deposited short somewhere nearby because of the roughness of the area. And they want to maintain that channel form. We refer to this as a graded channel.
Never mind. I see what
There's
we do.
there's not many streams that you'd ever find where they're perfectly graded all the time. Any natural disturbance event or human-caused event can disrupt that balance. But the important point is they're always trying to maintain these different inputs so they can just maintain some stable channel form. And as the rivers have developed these areas, I remember when I was first starting my career and doing riparian plantings and stuff, we had this kind of simplified conceptual model of what a cross section of a valley should look like. We were taught to identify a first or second terrace. This is that ancient terrace, so to speak, where the river used to be a long time ago. It dropped down, created a floodplain in a channel, and then dropped down again to more what we see now, where there is a channel, floodplain surface, and that ancient terrace surface. And of course, when the river was up here, back before it dropped down, then this terrace was the floodplain. That's where the river would bump out of its banks and go flood those areas, and there would have been riparian vegetation up there. Now we have this more multi-level kind of surface across most valley bottoms, And your main point is that the riparian vegetation is not going to be on these terrace surfaces. It's going to be on the floodplain surfaces. But human activities have caused a lot of disruption in this balance. And a big one that we see a lot is channelization or straightening the channel. And this is very beneficial for humans. It allows us to control the conveyance of water, allows us to control flooding, but it's very detrimental to the natural environment and especially riparian areas and the channels, how they can actually operate, be fully functional, be fully intact, and do all their good work. And of course, the reason this happens, it's tipping that scale of that balance. If we were to take this real simple example of a stream meandering its way through here from point A over in the green to point B in the red, starting elevation of 100 meters, ending elevation of 99 meters. So we have this sinuous stream, and if we went in there or there was some type of event that straightened it, well, the endpoints didn't change. You still have that same amount of vertical change, but you have a much shorter route to get there. And calculating slope is pretty simple. It's just that rise over run is going to give you the gradient, but straightening that channel in this example caused a 5-fold increase in the amount of slope. So when you do move that slope, bringing back Layton's balance, you're making it steeper. That's going to tip the scale down and lead towards degradation or incision. And so what that has occurred, this kind of old, or what that's created, this sort of old concept of we used to think you could go out in the landscape and see 1 or 2 terraces, the floodplain and the channel. What we're seeing now is there is still that ancient terrace, of course. We haven't gone back there. This happened before the Holocene or before the last glacial maxima. Then we have what we like to think of as the modern floodplain, but really I prefer to call it a Holocene terrace. There's so many examples out there just kind of ubiquitously that what should be the modern floodplain, since humans have really started developing areas, is really now operating like a terrace because we've had so much rampant incision. And we do know that this surface was created post-deglaciation, but we also know that it's often human caused to expose it or to make it behave more like a terrace. And so what we see now, rather than just some type of channel surrounded by a floodplain, you often have the channel and then a little tiny modern inset floodplain, this little kind of pocket where, just like that video showed, since the river incised, it's now trying to widen itself out and create a new floodplain surface. The problem here, of course, is that if we identify this Holocene terrace as a floodplain, this might be where we're putting riparian plantings. But they're so far down from that surface water, so far away from the water table, that maybe you got to put 6, 8, 10-foot whips just to get the feet wet, just so you can have some plantings grow, when really your new riparian standard is more in this area. And this is leading to a lot of our streams to be kind of stuck in this process zone. But ultimately abandoning the wide floodplain area that used to exist around 200 years ago. So when we're thinking about riparian projects and river restoration in general, we want to be thinking of that process area where the floodplain is in modern day. And everybody should be familiar with what the valley is. It's really simple, just that relatively flat area in between the hill slopes of any given drainage. So that's in the red line here. But more importantly is to focus on that valley bottom area. And you could still call this just the floodplain, but the valley bottom is a term that captures the entire channel and the floodplain or contemporary floodplain itself. And this is important because that represents the max extent of the riparian area. The full floodplain, maybe it gets captured in a 20-year, 50-year flood event. That's really quite high. We want to be in that area doing plantings that are getting wet every 1.5 to 2 years. And so that should be roughly within this valley bottom area. But part of that is we need to have a better understanding if we're going to be able to read the river for the sake of riparian plantings. We need to have this better understanding of what bankful discharge really is. And I hear this term a lot, just kind of unapologetically calling things bankful. And I do this all the time too. I like to shorthand bankful, just say bankful. But the definition that people often use is where the water level is the water level where the stream reaches the top of its banks and spills out onto the floodplain. This is kind of an incomplete understanding of where bankful came from, this whole concept of these dominant channel forming flows. So I'm going to walk through that. So bankful discharge is that dominant channel forming flow. It occurs roughly every 1.5 to 2 years or 1 to 2 years. And it itself, yeah, you can, if you have a stream gauge and you have a period of record that's long enough, you can calculate what that 1.5 to 2 year recurrence interval flood would be. But that's still a proxy for what we call effective discharge. And that's shown in this graph down here where you have the frequency throughout any given period of record of the discharge, how often those different discharge levels occur. And then this graph here, or this line here, the sediment discharge rating curve, that's how much sediment is being mobilized and transported downstream for any given discharge. When you multiply those together, you end up with this sort of bell-shaped curve that's going to, the peak of which is going to be that effective discharge, which ultimately is over a period of time, which flow does the dominant amount of geomorphic work and changes the landscape. And this really is a better indicator for the water table because it's going to be more correlated with the flows that occur most often and the flows that do the most geomorphic work. The reason we don't do effective discharge that often is if we have a gauge stream, we can get flow pretty well. That's easy enough. But getting the sediment discharge rating curve can be a bit of a chore, can take quite a bit of time and funding. And so not knowing exactly how much sediment is coming down, that's pretty common. But several studies have shown that effective discharge is very close to that bankfull discharge event occurring every 1.5 to 2 years. And so for a lot of us practitioners that go out there in the field and we're trying to assess things on the ground, we can find field indicators of bankfull discharge. Those might show up as scour lines or that surface of the inset floodplain. There might even be some woody vegetation at that elevation as well. And the importance in differentiating bankfull discharge and this concept of just bankfull where the water spills out is very important because our rivers are so incised in most cases. And so if you were just looking at this area at the top, this bankfull area where the water spills out, again, you're going to have those plantings so far away from where the actual water table is. But if you focus on the bankfull discharge and put plantings at that elevation, or at least ensure whatever you put up here is getting down that far, then you're going to have a higher chance of success. But ideally, you're looking into the future and trying to focus plantings on where that bankfull elevation occurs. And we do see this as, isn't just some made up concept or anything. We see this all the time when we start looking at the data. And as I mentioned before, many of these modern streams are in this alternative stable state. They've evolved over millennia, however many years. Then humans came in. We did all these actions that disrupted their balances. And so now they're stuck because we put them into a position where the natural occurrence of precipitation and soil composition and riparian growth and everything doesn't allow them to get kicked out. Like we have too many constraints and too many boundaries on them for them to just fix themselves. But where we see that kind of manifest in the bankfull idea is that taking this cross section here where the historic channel was up here and the modern channel's down here. And so these are the elevations across that same cross section. You have there's a road right here too. You can see that road surface is this high peak here. So the modern channel is very deep compared to this historic channel over here. If we were to take bankfull, put the plantings up here, again, we're so far down. If this was where the water was, we could do that top of bank spillover thing. But this concept just doesn't exist anymore because of incision. Because we're over here, we can't put the plantings up at this point. It's going to be difficult for them to reach the water. And our bankfull discharge is way down here, right? And this is, again, just a systemic widespread disturbance. And that's why it's important for us to understand what the bankfull channel is doing and how these rivers are operating so we can find the water for our riparian plants. Now, when we're reading the river for riparian restoration or anything really, trying to do river restoration projects or just trying to understand our rivers, the key questions that I like to focus on are where the river has been, looking back into the history of the river, where the river is now, how is it operating, how is it functioning, and then where's the river going? Can we look into the future and think about trajectory of where the river is evolving? What spaces is it going to occupy next? What is the trajectory of its hydrology? All that kind of stuff that'll help you plan, find locations that in the past may have been good for riparian areas, find out where you can get riparian growth to happen now or soon, and then plan ahead for as the river does evolve, you'll have a riparian stand ready to be occupied by the river. So some of the resources that are available out there, I'm just going to focus on two main products. They shouldn't be big surprises to anybody, but these are the things that I like to use. Of course, aerial imagery. And if you don't have Google Earth yet, then you really need to get with it. It's such a powerful, cool tool, not just for planning your recreation activities, but because they have this time slider ability. You can push this little clock here, and it gives you a time slider of aerial imagery that's available for any location across the globe. And you can go back in time for those, grab snapshots, or just peruse Google Earth to see what has happened, at least in recent history. So a big limitation with the Google Earth slider is, even though this shows it can go back to 1985, the stuff that's pre-1996 is usually pretty coarse, pretty difficult to look at a fine scale. You zoom way out and it's just big pixels, and so it works okay for large landscapes. But at least gives you some indication of what's been going on in the last few decades. And if you want to look back further, you really should be looking back further. You can go back to historicaerials.com. They typically have 1950s imagery, sometimes 1940s, rare occasions 1930s. It is a paid website, of course, and so if you are just using their web portal, you'll see this watermark on here. It's relatively cheap to buy these, but what I like to use it for is just pull it up, ignore the watermark, and you still get some nice free old imagery that you can compare to what you have now. But Earth Explorer, the USGS website, also allows you to go back and get single frame aerial imagery as far back in some cases 1930s. That can be really helpful too. But the problem, of course, with just aerial imagery is typically it only goes back to 1930s, maybe early 1930s, about as far back as you're going to get. And that's still after, in a lot of places, 100 years of human disturbance. So we can go back a little further. We can jump into these general land office surveys. These are available on the Bureau of Land Management website. And essentially this was surveyors marching across the West and drawing all the township and ranges, doing those public land surveys. But at the same time, they were also documenting settlements and roads and trails and natural resource areas. Like they'd remark whether the soil was good for agriculture, whether there's timber that was good for harvest. And they also mapped the rivers themselves. And the detail of the rivers isn't always great enough where you could use it as a direct comparison against modern imagery or modern LiDAR to see where the river was and compare it. It gives a decent indicator. What I really like to use it for, especially for understanding what the riparian used to look like, is a lot of these surveyors took notes as they were surveying. So when they cross places, you'd see notes of things like dense undergrowth, or there's alder only in the canyon. And now when you go back to those places, you might see this dense undergrowth area has no undergrowth at all. It's just ag, or maybe has just reed canary grass, some invasive species come in, or maybe alder only in the canyon. What we see now, and actually in this exact case, is the canyon area has lost almost all of its alluvium, has no place for riparian vegetation, and so you end up with no alder, and that gives us an indication that things have been disturbed quite a bit. So this gives you still a little bit of look into the past, but even late 1800s, some of these areas had 50 plus years of human disturbance. You look back at these surveys, and it's actually kind of amazing how many towns and trails and roads were already established at that time. And so to get back a little further and just use just a really powerful tool for doing all kinds of statistics or calculations, or just really understanding the way rivers are working, is using LiDAR. And if you're not familiar, it's basically a plane or a drone flying up above the surface of the Earth and shooting millions of little lasers down onto the ground. The time it takes for that laser to hit something on the ground and shoot back up to the scanner or the sensor on the aircraft is representative of the elevation. And so you get these beautiful continuous, basically, you can call them 3D, but just call them 3D surfaces of the land and vegetation all across wherever they scanned. And at this point, I'm just showing the Washington LiDAR portal, but at this point, almost all of Washington is covered by this data product of varying years from 2010 to 2024. But other states have this as well. Most Western states, at least, that I'm familiar with, are going to have some type of geospatial portal where you can download LiDAR. And LiDAR is extremely effective because it's that continuous topographic surface in the digital environment. So you can see all the different features of the river, make calculations, or just look beyond what imagery can show. One problem we have with LiDAR is that rivers have a downstream trend, right? They're always flowing downhill, trying to make it from wherever they're at to the ocean. And so when you try and symbolize this, I've got a hillshade underneath this one, so you can see the outline of the channel, but there's not really any benefit in this color coding to see what the differences are between that channel and the floodplain, so to say. So we can detrend it. We can take that downstream trend and flatten it out. And this we refer to as a relative elevation model. And really what that means is we're taking all of the elevation points out here in these raster cells, and we're saying, give me the relative elevation from the bottom of the channel out to that. So all of these colors now are a relative difference between the real elevation out on the floodplain and the elevation of the low flow channel. And the power of this is that it really makes all those different features out on the landscape pop. So the channel, of course, is in this kind of blue color, and elevation increases as you get towards through the greens and up into the reds. And then this really bright white is going to be really high. But this low flow channel here, you start seeing little pockets, this inset floodplain development. And this is what I was showing with that cross-section figure, where we might call this whole green area floodplain, but the channel has become incised and it's trying to widen itself. So it creates these inset floodplain pockets. These can be tremendous areas for getting riparian plantings to grow, because they're those depressions that are going to be closer to the water table, and they're going to get flooded more often. We can also see levees and dikes and roads and things really pop out. They're very stark elevational differences when you detrend the LiDAR. And they're going to be these really high humps, unnatural looking features longitudinally against the channel. So these might be areas that you might consider removing to allow the river to flood, or they might be areas that you want to potentially avoid from planting because they're going to be too high elevation to reach the water. Floodplain pockets also pop out really well. They're going to be the low-lying areas that are going to be similar elevation to the channel. That means they're going to you can make the argument they're going to flood more often because they're low elevation, or that they're just closer to that water table. And so those can be great areas to move beyond the channel margin and start expanding the lateral extent of that riparian area. Detrending the LiDAR also helps you see the historic flow path, right? So if we want to know where the river's been, this is one way you can do it. You look at that Holocene terrace elevation and you find the features that resemble historic channels. And I'll show in a sec, there is a quantitative way of doing this as well. So it's not just squinting and using your eyeballs. But you can find those features, and those may have underground flow paths where you can get to the water table easier. This might even be where you see some swampiness or just surface water that extends later into the year, so you can have greater success for your riparian plantings. There might even be sedges and stuff growing out here, and so you can get a diversity of water-loving tolerant species out there. A beautiful thing you can do with LiDAR as well is when you get this product from a contractor, you will get a surface model. It's going to be the first returns of those lasers that are shooting down, and it's going to grab all the trees, all the buildings, anything that's above the ground surface. It's going to be just the full representation of those LiDAR points. And then they also give you the ground or the terrain model. And this is already has the trees and buildings and stuff removed. But if you take the difference between those two, you subtract the ground elevations from those surface elevations, then you're essentially grabbing only the buildings, grabbing only the trees and shrubs. And so looking at just at the detrended LiDAR is very helpful, but then you can overlay it with any height of vegetation that you want. And what I'm showing here is just the canopy height. So this is only trees or vegetation that are above 6 meters tall. So you can overlay that, and yeah, you can see this type of stuff in aerial imagery, but by having it as a separate layer in this digital environment, you can calculate where shade is, or maybe start planning where you'd want to have rivers start evolving into, and knowing that there's going to be some type of hard point or root structure that's going to help keep new channel banks intact, or maybe open areas where you'd want to really prioritize adding additional riparian plantings. Now, I mentioned before that you can identify the historic channel. And of course, this is you can sort of squint and see this, but when we're creating a channel in GIS, we're running what's called a flow accumulation model. And it's taking that topography and trying to find the lowest, least cost pathway from upstream to downstream, and drops points or just locates all those areas continuously along a line. And that's going to be able to help us, that's going to allow us to find the exact location of the low flow channel. But you can run that same process and ignore the current channel. We know where it is, so let's just ignore it and run the same model out on the floodplain or this Holocene terrace. And it'll find the exact same thing, the lowest, least cost path trying to get to some downstream area. And this is really cool because even though this land has been cultivated, it's been tilled and moved around, there's still those low depression areas of where the channel used to be, and even old historic floodplain pockets shown in green, some of this lighter area, that's where it's trying to connect to the old channel there. And And so this is great for planning for the future. Maybe you want to eventually get the stream back to where it was, reverse the whole 200 years of disturbance, and give it a new chance to kickstart its processes and function as it used to. The other benefit, though, even if you can't do that, that can be a big effort, can be very costly, time intensive. You might not even have a landowner who's willing to do that. This is still going to have alluvium underneath that topsoil. It's still going to have water conveyance beneath the surface of the earth or surface of the soils. And as long as it has some type of connection, you should have easier access to the water table in these types of old historic flow paths. So they make great areas to target for plantings. And a really neat thing that you can do, because we flattened out that LiDAR, it essentially acts like a bathtub, or the channel acts like a bathtub. And we can artificially raise the water to any elevation we want to get a polygon or a boundary of that bankful channel. And so maybe you go out in the field and you identify that bankful elevation is at 40 centimeters from the bottom of the channel. You can just set this model and say, give me the extent of the 40 centimeter evolution above the channel. And so then you have now your delineated process on where the majority of the work is happening on the river, also the extent of where water is going to be being accessed or connected within that 1.5 to 2 year time frame. But it also greatly highlights big pockets like this at the bankful flow. Maybe we actually get out into the floodplain. These are the types of areas, if you want to get beyond that riparian buffer and start getting that kind of undulation pattern that many natural rivers have of their riparian corridor, then you can target these low-lying areas like this. Now, I want to talk a bit about the importance of structure in rivers and how it relates to riparian restoration. And this, the greater world of river restoration, right? We're trying to add structure in through the form of wood, whether it's engineered log jams or just low-tech structures or direct felling trees, or even harder approaches like not concrete, riprap, boulder weirs, just this obstructions in the channel that can help initiate sediment transport processes or reconnect the floodplain or excavate side channels, whatever, just trying to get dynamism back into the river. The whole idea is the fact that we have some type of hard point interacting with the hydraulics that can get sediment to move around, erode, and deposit. And the key impacts related to riparian recovery and that world of river restoration is that we're trying to, in a lot of cases, get outside of this alternative stable state caused by incision or some other human-caused impact. And the process is a bit slow, right? We can have disturbance happen really fast, but to get outside of that, the river has to go through this cycle of receiving flood events and getting sediment to move around. And what people don't have a whole lot of appetite for is that it often needs to have some erosion first to get outside of that alternative stable state. So it needs to widen. If it's dropped down into a really confined channel, it has to, just like that video showed, it has to start widening again, it has to start moving around and creating space. And as that channel widens, the water velocity is lower because the water can spread out. And this is going to initiate sediment deposition of that suspended stuff that we want our plants to get access to. That'll start piling up. And we can also, by reducing the velocity, get pockets for bed load. And that's going to give us the base layer of that stream bed to start building it up and recapture the areas that have been lost through disturbance. And as that happens over time, then we can start reconnecting the floodplain, that Holocene terrace area. So if we don't allow the river the time to just naturally reestablish a new floodplain area, we want to try and reverse this incision process and bring the bed back up so we can get water to occur naturally out on the floodplain when we have flood events. The ultimate goal here with any type of restoration, there's all kinds of tactics, but we want to be able to slow the transport of wood, water, and sediment. Those are the types of materials that just need to stay within the systems. They're getting evacuated so quickly that we can't get these streams outside of this stable state so that they can behave naturally and dynamically. This is reflected in this channel evolution model. This is slightly modified from McClure and Thorne 2013. We just added discontinuous and single thread channels as a potential type of reach type that can still be in pristine condition. But within years, or even sometimes one flood event, you can have incision events that channelize the river and put it into this degraded state. Widening can, if there's enough flood and enough sediment mobility, widening can happen pretty fast. especially if if you haven't got dropped down into some hard pan layer like clay or paleosols or bedrock, it can still widen itself out. And once it does that, it can then degrade. But now we're talking, if we go around this wheel, we're talking up to decades, centuries, even millennia to get back to that stage. So that's why we do a lot of river restoration, is try and kickstart this or expedite the process so that we can have more areas, not just for the river and flooding, but also more areas for riparian growth. And the process by which this occurs, why structure is so important, is sometimes so this is a 3D hydraulic model just running over a concrete weir. Not that we want to be putting concrete in there, but the idea is still the same. When we talk about water velocity, sometimes we're only thinking of the average velocity in that channel, but obstructions in the channel, little undulations in the channel margins, rocks that are out there are going to cause different areas of slow water and fast water. So this hydraulic model is showing really slow water in blue up to faster water in red. And so that those red areas, that fast water is going to allow sediment to continue to be transported. But that slow water, any obstruction is going to create some type of eddy with the slow water. That's where that fine sediment can fall out. That's where riparian areas can be protected. That's where they can thrive. That's where seeds can start accumulating and get natural recovery of the riparian area. And these responses, we can model them. We've seen them over the many decades of doing restoration projects. They're fairly predictable at this point. Water behaves by the laws of physics. And so when we put an obstruction in there, we know generally where there's going to be slow water, where there's going to be fast water. And then we also know the relationship between sediment transport and water velocity, that then we can predict where there's going to be deposition versus erosion. So this example on a Soton Creek with just a post-assisted log structure, a bunch of wood hanging out here. You've got this fast water coming over here, right? That's, again, where the sediment's going to be transported. Not much deposition occurring here. Some larger stuff will fall out as it touches against obstructions, and that's okay. But for riparian growth, riparian expansion, we really want to be thinking about these eddy areas, these areas that are behind obstructions where the water can slow down. So this juxtaposition between the fast water and slow water is going to create a shear zone so you can get different water velocity areas for different size classes of sediment to fall out. This slow water, really great for biota, really great for fish. It's not like we're going to have a ton of riparian growth underwater here, right? But just off the picture, you see a little bit of brown here. Because this created such a big eddy, there is a bunch of fine sediment that's been deposited because of having that slow water out there. And that makes, again, just prime location for you to go out there and put in some stakes to initiate the riparian recovery process, or just let the river be itself if you have a seed source, and that's where that riparian will naturally start growing. And when you put these structures, any type of structure in the channel, again, you can see actions happen pretty quick in some cases. And on the Soton Creek project, there was a high flow event shortly after we put in some structures. And so you see channel widening happening almost immediately. And it's creating all kinds of dynamic habitat, opening up some spaces for deposition to occur that, even though right now this is larger substrate, maybe not ideal for plantings, over time with additional structure or just additional flow events, this is also still going to be the areas, because it's depositional, where fine sediment can fall out. And at some point, when you have an obstruction in the channel, it can only affect the water velocities up to the confining margins. So even 7 years later, the structure is maintained. The channel form compared to 2017 after that first flow event is pretty similar, but it's kept those areas of slow water, fast water. And so when we talk about maintenance, going back to a project site and making sure that our structures or our riparian plantings are still doing good, you can revisit locations like this, take advantage of those eddies, take advantage of where water's being flooded because of a structure, and target those for additional planting or maintenance. And it doesn't have to be small stuff, like we see this in large engineered log jam structures too. You put in an obstruction, you have predictable responses. And so this post-restoration imagery on the Iniat River of a large apex structure, you can see darker water here, some pools have developed, and some deposition behind. But just like the canopy height model stuff, we can take two different LiDAR surfaces, an old one and a new one, subtract the elevations from each other, and you get the change that's happened between those 2 years. So this DEM of difference, or geomorphic change detection model, is going to show where there's been erosion and deposition between 2 years of LIDAR. The high areas or depositional areas are shown in brown. The lower areas or places that eroded between those time periods are shown in blue. So you wouldn't necessarily want to plant in these erosive areas. That's where the water velocity is going to be higher. And so it could just scour out your plants or just make them unhealthy and they're not going to survive anyway. But these large areas, again, in that big wake of the structure, that's where the water velocity drops. That's where you're going to have the fine sediment drop out. That's where natural seeds are going to occur. So you can expedite this process by focusing planting efforts in areas like this. It's not going to make a buffer in this case, right? If your goal is to have a riparian buffer, that's not what this is for. But you can still get pockets of thriving vegetation so that when there's future disturbance events, you have that resiliency. You also are creating seed banks for downstream reaches that can, during future flood events, grab those seeds and put them out onto the floodplain. And we can get a lot of big effects from structures, especially when they're channel spanning. You're going to have some type of effect on the water's surface level by putting an obstruction in the channel. But things like beaver dam analogs or any channel spanning structure are going to have a much more drastic effect because they're stopping water, right? You're raising the surface elevation and forcing it to expand beyond its banks and start spreading out. And by even in the short term, using something like a BDA or a channel spanning log jam, now the water table, at least in this local area, has been raised. Whatever this surface is, it's saturating soils all across the valley bottom here. And so you could target, assuming reed canary grass wasn't completely out of control, you could target whips and plugs and things along these areas and give them a better chance of survival because they now have water further into the dry season. And just bringing this concept home, the reason it works, if we were to just take a simplified cross-section of the channel, so we take a channel, cut it down the middle, and look at it from the side. We have water flowing from left to right. There's the top of the bank way up here. Maybe this is the water height at the low flow channel and the stream bed down at the bottom. So you put in two obstructions. Again, if these are channel spanning, you're going to have a greater effect. But even spanning something across moving water 50% or more is going to raise the water to some degree. And so almost immediately you put an obstruction in, you'll see the water rise. And it's not going to just have some continuous non-stopping effect upstream. It's going to reach the top of whatever that obstruction is, and that'll be the water surface level up until it reaches a gradient upstream somewhere where it can't raise anymore. But because that happened, we slowed the water down, we raised it up a bit. That slow water is going to promote deposition as sediment is transported downstream and start raising up the stream bed, at least locally behind those structures. And as you do this over years or give it time or do additional management, as long as there's structure in there and the river can continue to recruit sediment and deposit sediment, you see that incision level reduce because the stream bed is starting to capture alluvium just like it did in history and raise up. The beauty, of course, then, is that the water raises with it. And with the surface water comes the water table. And so you're bringing that water table up closer to the surface so you can actually have riparian species grow and thrive. Additional benefit, of course, is by grading this area of alluvium between the old stream bed and the new stream bed. That's the hyporeic zone where you can have water filtering down through all the gravels and alluvium and keeping cool. So as it goes down, it's not being exposed to solar radiation. It's going to pop up somewhere downstream and emerge as colder than the water on the surface that was exposed to the sun. So this is what we want to see over the long term, and not just to take care of the riparian buffer right up against the channel, but get the riparian to expand out laterally across the historic floodplain. And as we do this, as we raise the bed, we can make more areas like this, more areas that explode out and push water out into the floodplain. If we could have this entire area, ideally, all of this would eventually be kind of out where the historic channel was. And maybe the long term, this could avulse and erode enough to reoccupy the old channel and just get exposed into that or have access to what the floodplain used to be, that old Holocene terrace. But even in the short term, being able to have this retain water longer can expand that lateral extent of the riparian area. So the bottom line is that planting projects do struggle in degraded systems. We have found a lot of ways to improve our successes. There's been a lot of great riparian planting projects out there, but then I also hear a lot of frustration just because it's hard to get things to grow. Sometimes, arguably, we're happy with like a 20% survival rate of our plantings, and that is good in some cases because our previous is like 5%, but it should be better. And one of the reasons we're having trouble is because the systems are so degraded and the water table is down, and we're not, in some cases, not properly identifying where that floodplain surface is, where the plantings can get down to water. And so to get a better understanding of this, it is important to look back at the river's history and where it's been, how it used to behave, where it's at now, and where that water table is, and look out into the future so that you can set the stage, not just by right now having good resiliency for future flood events or future disturbance events, but set the stage for when the river, or if the river does avulse into an area, it has riparian plantings, has roots, it has seed banks, it has things to work with so that it can be dynamic and resilient. But this also means ideally that we'd be looking beyond the banks. And I do understand that so many programmatics are requiring just like a standard buffer width or something like that, but it's not that common where you just have a sliver of riparian area directly against a riparian corridor, because the river has made all those depressions and stuff in the landscape. Riparian areas and intact, pristine systems tend to be very dynamic, not just in vegetation composition, but also in location. They're water-loving species and they need to get down into those areas. And so if we can capture or target those types of areas better, we will improve our riparian planting success, but we'll also create a more dynamic and natural looking system. And so to help with that, I think it's just extremely important to incorporate plantings into any larger river restoration planning project, or vice versa. If you've got a restoration project, you need to be adding riparian plantings into there. You need to kickstart these processes to keep them going so that we can have healthy rivers again. With that, I'll wrap it up, and thank you all very much. I have some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Reed. That was fantastic. I do see we have a message in the chat. Two questions, actually. When is the best time to install BDAs and PALs, and when should plant, and after installation, when should planting occur?
The best time for BDAs and PALs is ideally you'd have water in the system. We're going to be locked in. A lot of places we work are in salmon recovery regions, and so you're going to have an in-water work window anyway. If you don't have salmon in that area, which the in-water work window is roughly July 15th to September 15th, and there's variability in there depending where you are. One problem in some of our areas is if you wait for those summer months and those when base flow is really low, the water might be dry, right? Or the river might be dry. And so it's difficult to see that immediate feedback when you put in a structure to know that your structure is working. And in particular with BDAs, you're trying to clog everything up with willow whips and sediment and alluvium to make a full-on channel spanning obstruction and create a pond. So if you don't have water, then you can't actually see that happen. So you don't know until a flood comes if it worked. So ideally, it's during a time period where you just have water in there, but it obviously can't be during flooding because it wouldn't be safe and you would have a lot of difficulty building something. But as far as when plantings should occur, then I like to, because you're getting them wet immediately, I like to do it right then and there when you're building those structures, but then come back again in the fall or come back again in the following spring and even build in adaptive management into the project so you can come back year to year as the channel changes and start peppering in new whips into those areas. So there's not just like one thing that's one and done. You can have success by building the structure and taking advantage of the areas that you're adding water to, but it's good to and mostly beneficial to come back as the river evolves and plant new areas.
And let's see, Kyle Hill. I think I'm grabbing all of these. Oh, there's quite a few. A lot of cheers as well for a wonderful job. Is concrete not ideal because of the impractical cost and or the potential pH impacts or something else altogether? Is reclaimed concrete a feasible substitute for natural riprap?
Yeah, I mean definitely on my soapbox. Like I don't want to see any rivers in concrete because it's not natural, right? And then the river can't move and evolve and behave naturally. And I know that it's a very successful way to control rivers and make sure that you can You think of like the Concrete River in Colfax, like that town would have a very hard time persisting if the river was allowed to flood. So there's obviously areas where humans are living that we need to have concrete to control the rivers, but it's not a state that a river can thrive or be successful in. And in terms of using it for riprap, like there is no real natural riprap. There's boulder berms that can accumulate during large flood events, and those act as obstructions in natural rivers. But they're also of size and of composition that when a similar flood event comes along, it can remove it and take it out and rework that substrate. The problem with riprap is we're over engineering and we're putting like boulders that are way too big for the river to move, and so it's in there in perpetuity. But in those areas where that's the only option, you need to control the river, it's still good to take advantage of broken up concrete or riprap or whatever and plant those. Just jam a bunch of whips in between the spaces in between the riprap so that at the minimum, even though you're not allowing the river to behave naturally, you can get shade on it and you can get that natural filtration from the roots from any contaminants that might be entering the stream.
And we also have Kyle Hill with Washington Water Trust, and Darla also is asking this question: is there a specific workflow or tool to create the relative elevation model?
Yes, there's lots of ways to do it. Some of you may be familiar with the geomorphic grade line tool. The whole area of stage zero restoration has been using that, and it is effective when planning stage zero restoration. It's a cross-sectional method that can create some really weird features. So if you're not familiar how to use it, um, I, I wouldn't unless you're using a stage zero project. What I prefer to use is called the IDW method, the inverse distributed weighting. Look it up. I think that's what it was, but IDW. And there are tools built into QGIS and ArcPro that are just do that method and make it fairly easy. There's lots of websites available too. If you go or forums, you Google how do I create a relative elevation model, you'll find nice workflows to make that easy. But the beauty, years ago we had to do this all manually. Now there are tools that help you go through that process in Arc and Q.
Then Julie Connolly with Ecology asked, in areas like the Pataha Creek picture, are there risks of the stream being directed to areas where it will go subsurface? And I'm going to add one more question here. It has to do with recommendations for practitioners for climate change. And we have 1 minute to answer all that before we go to break.
What was the first question?
Oh, sorry. Julie's question of Pataha Creek
Mhm.
pictures, there are risks of the stream being directed to areas where it will go subsurface.
Yeah, and that Pataha Creek example, we did have a intensive monitoring infrastructure, several stream gauges, we did several habitat surveys, and that stream had eroded. You saw the banks there, it's like 30 feet down. Lots of places were on bedrock. And so we did see not things going subsurface or completely dry, but we were seeing major gaining and losing reaches with the surface flow because of that elevation difference between the bedrock. Some places the bedrock was really exposed to the surface, sometimes really low down. And so we're seeing variations in the surface flow. We didn't know that before we did the restoration in that case. So we didn't know, but now we know now. So we didn't, yeah, there wasn't necessarily fears, but that is what happened. Not going dry, but definitely not being as effective in some spots as it could be. And then as quick as possible, what was the second one?
Do you have any recommendations for how practitioners, oh, and now somebody else asked another question, might
Climate
consider
change.
impacts of climate change, more flood events, flashiness into the evaluation of bank full width?
Yes. If you tie it to that 1.5 recurrence interval, to get that, you're looking at the period of record in the flow gauge. And because we have non-stationary norms where we can't necessarily look at weather patterns in the past to predict the future as well as we used to be able to, then that bank flow elevation could change if you're using the recurrence interval flow method. But if you can just go out there and look at field indicators, that might be more beneficial. You'd get that exact elevation that you can then work with in GIS. And in terms of just all around climate.
Well, thank you. A lot of comments in the chat saying how wonderful this
And
presentation
retain
was.
it
So
inside.
part, oh, did I just, well, I thought you were finished with your thought there.
I,
Sorry.
I must have blipped. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are moving now into our 10-minute break, and we'll see you back here at 10:40. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Reed. Well, welcome back, everybody. We're doing great on time. I'm going to turn it over to Tori.
So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, which is Carson Brisky. Carson Brisky graduated from Central Washington University with a Bachelor of Science degree in environmental science, specializing in geography. He grew up in the Alaska salmon fishing industry, where his passion for environmental rehabilitation grew. Shortly after graduating from CWU, Carson joined the Mid-Columbia Fisheries team in 2019, where he remains today as a project manager. He enjoys everything associated with the outdoors, especially hunting, fishing, and habitat restoration. Carson will discuss when irrigation should be considered in your riparian planting plan and how to accomplish it. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Carson, to share your screen.
Awesome. Thank you, Tori. All right. Sound check. Can you hear me, Tori?
Loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. So, as Tori just said, you guys got a little glimpse into my life for the little bit of a narration of me. But I'm Carson Brisky. I'm a project manager here at Mid-Columbia Fisheries Enhancement Group. And today I'm going to be talking about irrigation in riparian areas. Why, when, and how. So to kind of get a little bit of a gist of irrigation and when you need it and how you need to perform it, you need to know your key site conditions. So essentially, does your site have low annual precipitation? Maybe it has a moderate annual precipitation or high. What is the varying snowpack at that site? What is the depth to groundwater? We'll go over a little bit of that. I have a table on one of the future slides that will go over depth to groundwater and when irrigation is needed and when it is not needed. Soil textures. You have cobbly soils. Do you have fine soils? Do you have clay-like material soils? That all comes into consideration on if you can successfully implement irrigation in one of your riparian areas. Um, Inundation frequency, duration, and velocity at a project site. How often and how long and how fast is that water or site being inundated? And then most importantly, water availability to that riparian site. Is that water source present at that site? Do water rights exist? And what is the logistics of getting water to plants in a feasible fashion? So firstly, I like to consider on any project site, why do we irrigate? The obvious answer to that is to increase plant survival. We have a lot of funding coming through. We have a lot of funding from different agencies, and we want to respect that funding and we want to increase plant survival to show that we care for those projects. We want to promote fine root development during establishment when groundwater isn't available, or at least when areas where groundwater is below 5 feet. And we want to accelerate growth to those plants to meet shading and height requirement goals. And we also like to implement plants for bank erosion as well. So why do we want to irrigate? Continued. This table shows groundwater conditions, methods of planting, and irrigation types. So when groundwater conditions are shallow, 2 feet or shallower, conventional planting, like hand dug plants being planted roughly 18 inches in the ground, usually irrigation is not required. In some cases where there's more of a drier climate, you can put an irrigation system on that riparian site for at least 1 year if you want to protect the investment. If you have moderate groundwater elevation, so 2 to 3 feet deep, if you're conventionally planting that site, you'll likely be required to have some sort of irrigation method for at least 1 to 3 irrigation seasons. If you have the option to deep plant, irrigation is not required. That depends on how much funding you have and accessibility to your project site. And lastly, deep water or deep groundwater, say 3 to 6 feet of to the groundwater. Conventional planting, you'll be required to irrigate for another 1 to 3 years. In some instances, in more mature sites, the fourth year is required in more drier areas, but not necessarily necessary. Deep planting is another option for this, which does not require irrigation. Then you have dryland areas that are 6 to 7 feet depths to groundwater. And normally those practices and planting methods are conventional planting. And again, irrigation is definitely required for 1 to 3 years. And then in this aspect, maybe 4 years if funding allows. So when do we like to irrigate? So at Mid-Columbia, we have different irrigation schedules for a lot of our different projects, but it mainly kind of gravitates to the summer dry period, typically May, June to October, variable according to site climate and year, and it's also variable according to site elevation, precipitation, and the aridity zone. So if anyone is geographically familiar with central Washington, we have riparian established areas that we irrigate all the way in the Cle Elum area, all the way down past Yakima, Washington. And a lot of that area is moderately different from one another and requires different irrigation schedules. But realistically, our frequency for irrigation for the first year of implementation, we like to water at least 1 time a week, so usually 4 times a month. And then second or third year plantings, we like to irrigate roughly 2 times a month. And then on the off chance that plant establishment is slowed due to a drier climate, like I've said in the past, we like to irrigate into possibly a fourth year, with usually 1 time a month being our schedule. Oops. Excuse me. Hold on. My apologies. And then how do we irrigate? So in Mid-Columbia, we have roughly 3 ways that we like to irrigate our riparian sites, and each one of those has different watering depths. The first irrigation method is drip irrigation. It's deep watering. Water's delivered normally at 2.5 to 2 gallons per hour. So 2 gallons per plant roughly gives each plant 5 gallons per watering cycle. And this is more of a direct source of irrigation. So that water is staying in that soil column around those roots, promoting fine root growth and establishment. Broadcast irrigation is shallow. Water is delivered at variable rates and at an indirect irrigation method. We also do, on occasion, handheld hoses watering. This is another shallow watering method. Water is delivered at variable rates, and then also deep watering is not feasible. To get deep watering from handheld hose watering, it would take a crew of at least 4 to 8 people a substantial amount of time to successfully water, say, 1,000 plants, which is our norm for most of our plantings. And then how would we like to compare a lot of these irrigation styles? Comparison of irrigation methods, we have the conditions on the left, and then the 3 types that Mid-Columbia Fisheries Enhancement uses. So we have broadcast, hose and hand watering, and drip line irrigation. So to briefly go over our highest efficiency plantings to be used for broadcast irrigation would be seedbed plantings or more of an agricultural based implementation. Hose and hand watering is small plant numbers, usually good for say 200 plants or less. And then drip line irrigation is usually great efficiency for high plant numbers, over 1,000 plants to 5,000 plants. The initial cost investment Mid-Columbia we use for broadcast irrigation is normally tripod mounted sprinklers. So we haven't really gotten into the realm, but in the future we are of like handheld or handline agricultural irrigation, but for now, we'll just specifically talking about um, tripod mounted transportable sprinklers. So the initial cost investment is low for both broadcast and hand hose watering, and moderate for drip line. Just because for drip line, you have to buy a lot of materials, you have to buy a lot of poly pipe, emitters, and quarter-inch lines. Um, is essentially water applied to the deep soil column for any of these um, irrigation methods? It's no for both hand hose and broadcast irrigation, but yes for drip line. And a lot of the things that we like to compare for a lot of our irrigation methods is how much is that labor cost and how much are those weed management needs going to be raised with different irrigation types. So we've kind of cost compared a lot of our methods, and we have found that with labor and weed management needs, broadcast irrigation is low on the labor end, but high when it comes to labor and removal of weed management, because a lot of that water is being broadcasted across, whole entire site where everything is being watered. While if you have more of a direct irrigation type like drip line, your weed management needs are very low because, like I said, your water is staying within the soil column and not being dispersed widely throughout the project area. Um, water use efficiencies are extremely low with broadcast irrigation because you're watering a lot of unnecessary vegetation, whether that be native but more realistically invasive weed material. Hose and hand watering and drip line, you have a moderate and a high efficiency use of water because, like I said, if you water with a drip irrigation on one plant, you're only using 5 gallons per that 2 hours of watering cycle. Um, for a lot of these systems, for broadcast irrigation and drip line, water rights are required. And with hose and hand watering, you can get away with no water rights if you have a water truck or a poly tank that's no smaller than at least 450 gallons to make it worthwhile. So here now we have an irrigation type overview. Broadcast irrigation overview. Unfortunately, when using this method, it does not penetrate mulch and soil effectively for deep root establishment. So with this, it only means like the top 1 to 3 inches, depending on how long our crew can be out there. Only the few inches are being saturated with the soil, and even longer if there is at least 6 inches of mulch on top of that used for weed suppression. This is best suited for agricultural irrigation or seedbed establishment. I would not recommend using the tripod mounted sprinklers for any sort of agricultural practice on a large scale. But if you were trying to water an acre or less, that would probably be very efficient. Unfortunately, like I said, broadcast irrigation promotes weed growth and greatly increases need for weed management. Hose and hand irrigation. It's used for small plantings up to 200 plants, used in newly implemented project sites to water in plants if soil conditions are dry. If you're digging in and you're planting the plants anywhere from 18 inches to 3 feet deep and you're just not getting into moist soil, it is on your best behalf to probably water those plants in as you're watering. It does increase your labor time up front, but we have seen moderate increases in survivability come that next spring. Simultaneous watering is inefficient. Realistically, with hose and hand watering, you can realistically only irrigate only 4 plants at a time, which increases your labor costs substantially. Poor ability to control water pressure in gallons a minute. Not necessarily based on the system that you're using, but everyone, say you're watering the plants, you've instructed your crew to assist a hose and water a plant every 2 minutes. If they don't have that on a timer for 2 minutes, I don't know if it's been scientifically proven, but everyone's 2 minutes is probably a little different in your head when you're watering X amount of plants daily. Drip irrigation, which I'm moderately biased to. Water is delivered directly into the soil column. Deep soil penetration is exceptional for deep root establishment, even with mulch. So you can get that emitter right around the base of the plant and it'll irrigate most efficiently around that soil column. The water delivery system, pump, and filter are transportable to other sites. So you can buy, realistically, you can buy one irrigation pump and one irrigation filter system and use it at 10 sites if you had an appropriate irrigation schedule cycle. The gallons a minute are delivered to each plant very precisely, and this is based off of the pressure reducers that you use. A lot of the time, we do 20 to 25 psi reducers, and we have found within realistic approaches, you can get that accurate 2.5 to 2 gallons a minute or hour uh, plant irrigation cycle, very precise. Maintenance is key. Water filtration is critical. We have a filtration sucking hose that gets the water out of our irrigation source that filters in a cycle. And then we also have a secondary 300 micron brush filter that we hook up that is right before the water is pushed into the drip irrigation system. We have found that it works fairly well, especially if you're receiving water from a algae-ridden pond. A lot of those sediments are extracted from there, and clogging is usually not a problem. We have found as you work down the line, down to your emitter, shown here is a 2.5 gallon per hour emitter, flag emitter, that you can easily clean out if you ever have any setup problems or gallons per hour problems. So briefly, I put together a easy to read cost comparison for these irrigation types. I would be more than happy to answer questions on the breakdown of this. I have, a more recent breakdown for 2025 prices. But this is just based off of 1,000 plants for each of the three irrigation types. So with drip irrigation per 1,000 plants, normally need a 2-inch Honda water pump that's roughly 150 gallons a minute expectancy. Filtration materials are moderately expensive, but are definitely needed for a drip irrigation system. Installation per 1,000 plants roughly takes 4 days. So $2,000 a day. That's roughly 8-person crew, restoration crew. And then labors for the growing season usually only takes 1 or 2 crew members per irrigation scheduled day. Per 2 growing seasons is only roughly $8,100. The irrigation system is easily maintained. The only thing really that anyone is ever concerned about is clogged emitters, but with those flag emitters that we found, they're easily cleaned out. And then removal day is usually 1 day per an 8-person crew for 2,000 days or $2,000 per day. Easily removed. And also, I must say, is easily reusable. We reuse a lot of our poly material. The only aspect of that is our 1/2-inch lateral lines that we poke emitter heads into. That spacing does vary per project site, so a lot of that is needed to be either reused or recycled. So this totals up to $21.50 per plant. Broadcast irrigation per 1,000 plants. We use the same water pump, the same filtration system. The only limiting factor for our filtration system is that we don't use that 300 micron brush filter. Irrigation material is moderately inexpensive. I believe one of those tripod mounted sprinklers is $120 to $200. Installation is none because it's transportable through the site. Labor for growing season is roughly $30,000, and that's also on the aspect of an 8-person crew, $2,000 a day. Um, a lot more weed management, a lot more moving around of the irrigation system, um, and just a lot more hands-ons needed for to implement broadcast irrigation, which in theory will increase your per plant cost of $31. And then lastly, hose watering or polytank watering. You can hose water with a water right by drawing from the stream or the river. But just for example, hose watering with a polytank, you're going to roughly use an 1.5 to a 2-inch pump. That is about the same price of $550. And then your irrigation materials will include the 450-gallon polytank. One thing is you don't need as an aggressive filtration system for these pumps because a lot of the water is expelled neatly through that irrigation hose that you'll be using. And installation is zero, it's transportable, but where costs increase is your labor for 2 growing seasons. If you only have 4 hoses working at a time and you need to water 1,000 plants, that's going to take you an extremely long time, especially if you're watering plants roughly 2 minutes per plant. And then you have the other aspect of going and refilling your 450-gallon poly tank off-site. That can various ranges of time to fill that up. And that increases your growing season labor doubled from broadcast irrigation to roughly $60,000 to make it 6133 per plant. And like I said, I can break these down even more and I have more cost comparisons, but for today's aspect, I found this to be the most appropriate. So some project examples that we have of all 3 irrigation types. The first one being drip irrigation at Imagine a Forest on River Mile 160 near Ellensburg, Washington. So these site conditions, the water table depths were roughly 42 to 60 inches below ground surface, moderately well-draining soils, irregular subsite locations, shapes, and we had private water access, which was great. One thing about drip irrigation, if you have irregular polygon plantings, this is extremely malleable and easy to work with, that poly line that we use for drip irrigation. The water source was available on site with water rights from the landowner. The reason we put in drip irrigation was to accelerate plant growth, to slow bank erosion, outcompete invasive vegetation, and exceed browse height. As you can see, the picture on the right was taken, I believe, in 2023. So we even have more substantial growth at that project site to date. The irrigation has been removed from a lot of those sites. And also we've steered away from using a lot of that plastic weed suppression fabric and gone to mulch suppression. So continued drip irrigation at Imagine a Forest at River Mile 160. Here's some of our results. In 2022, we watered at least once a week, and each plant got 5 gallons per plant. And I believe there were roughly over 3,000 plants at this project site. So we've had great success. In 2023 and 2024, we dialed that irrigation back to 2 times a month, but still getting 5 gallons per plant per watering cycle. We reduced a lot of that irrigation time so those tap roots can establish. As good as it seems to spoil those plants in year 1, reducing that water back is ideal to have that tap root established. But after year 3, we had 71% success and survival rate throughout that planting establishment. Um, but as much as I can say how good drip irrigation is, there are risks to it. We have found in unfenced areas there can be substantial wildlife interaction. We've had beavers chew through the drip irrigation system on all the lateral lines, depending on project site. But we've also had voles during the winter time that burrow beneath the soil and snow compact layer. We've had them discover a lot of the quarter-inch line and chew through those. And we've also had some interaction with bull elk, um, using their antlers to either while they're rubbing on our plants or they just happen to get tangled up. It's never been anything substantial, but we have noticed it. They're easily cut with mowers or brush cutters. If the crew's ever doing weed management, it is prone to keep an eye on and where a lot of that quarter-inch line is. It's hard to see and it can easily get mowed over. Maintenance is required for proper function. Like I said, we have to maintain um, efficiency with our filters so our emitters don't get clogged. But if the emitters get clogged, it does take time for one or two, three crew members to walk the lines to make sure each plant and each emitter is working properly. And then additionally, winterization and flushing of the system is a must. A lot of our valving systems, if they aren't flushed properly, will break during the winter time if they freeze due to the expansion of the ice in our valves. A lot of that poly material that we use for the main lines, the lateral lines, and then the lines going directly to the plant, we've had great success. They're more they have a bigger ability to expand and contract during the winter and during the summer months. So that isn't as necessarily much of a risk, but the ball valves and the other valves that we have on our system do break during the winter if not properly maintained. Um, and then we have project site number 2 as an example, which is Spring Creek, also located near Ellensburg, Washington. We did 2 different types of irrigation just to kind of test things out for efficiency. We did broadcast irrigation in 2022, and then we had a crew member observe that the broadcast irrigation just wasn't penetrating the mulch layer that was used for weed suppression on the upper terraces as well as we thought they could have. It was moderately penetrating the soil, but only 1 to 2 inches per the realistic watering schedule that our crew could offer. So we decided to kind of dial things back and use direct hose irrigation in 2023. To kind of get the gist of the conditions of this site, this was a large pasture that was used historically for agriculture and grazing. Um, 11,300 plants were conventionally planted in 2021 on the upper terraces on bank left. And the water table depth was roughly 36 to 48 inches below ground surface in those upper terrace elevations. Um, we wanted to do this to increase survival in higher elevation areas, and then we began irrigation in 2022. We irrigated sections separately due to water pressure reasonings, and then we also had a water source available on site. So we didn't have to truck or bring in any water to the site, which would make things very inefficient. And then we also found that uh, essentially we needed to figure out the most appropriate way to water all 11,300 plants. And it was very time consuming, but the results were surprisingly very impressive. We don't have any concrete numbers thus far for survival monitoring results that I could share with you today, but these are just the results based on 2022 and 2023 irrigation seasons. We found that not that hose watering was more of a direct source of irrigation, but it was an extremely more um, essentially more appropriate form of irrigation rather than broadcast irrigation. And the crew's weed management needs at this site drastically fell from 2022 to 2023. So with all of this, there are risks of broadcast irrigation that I couldn't express anymore. More surface area coverage results in all vegetation receiving water. This increases our costs for weed management, whether that we have the crew go out there and do brush cutting, mowing, or hand pulling, or spot spraying with herbicide, or we have to contract out to other agencies in the area. And unfortunately, with what we're all trying to conserve is water use efficiency. We found that broadcast irrigation, in this sense, for riparian irrigation, was a high water consumption and was not an efficient source of irrigation. And with that, I couldn't thank our restoration crew itself more. They do fantastic work. For anyone that's not familiar with Mid-Columbia Fisheries, we roughly have 7 to 10 seasonal restoration crew members that are highly qualified, and they actually implement and construct a lot of our irrigation systems. And I would say I'm proud to have each and every one of them on our crew. It's just great to have them. And that is it for me. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I have my email here. I can talk by phone. I love talking about irrigation. I can share some of my new findings, my old findings, my rough patches, pros and cons about each irrigation system even more, and some of our future uses of irrigation that are going to be a lot more technologically advanced than the ones I showed you today. So we have a lot of exciting new projects that we're going to be implementing more agricultural based irrigation systems to riparian areas. And I hope to probably present on that in coming symposium, popular symposium presentations. So thank you.
Thank you, Carson. Really enjoyable. We are slightly over time, but there was one question I think that deserves going back to Elaine Nedson with Lincoln CD was asking about the chart that you displayed. Let me get back. Oh, now I lost it here. Maybe Elaine can unmute and ask the question. We have various comments coming in here right now, but there we go.
Oh,
There's
somebody
Elaine.
sent me a screenshot of it, so I got it.
Oh, you're
And
good to go. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
And my
Oh, I
last name
see the
is
Jake.
yeah, and my
Yeah,
last
your
name is
question.
Canute. And my
Oh,
last name is
Knutson.
Knutson. Yeah, thank you.
So sorry. Thank you so much. Well, thank you,
Okay.
Carson. Well,
Yeah,
we are going
no
to
problem.
transfer. We are going to transfer over now to our next presenter. And while they get ready for that, let me share my screen real quick. Very excited to welcome Chris Kosick and Kelsey Collins with Washington Department of Ecology to talk about water rights. And Christopher Kosick graduated from the University of Washington with a BS in biology, with a minor in marine biology and a minor in law, societies, and justice. Originally from Western Washington, after graduating, he took multiple fisheries positions around Central and Western Washington before joining the Department of Ecology's Water Resources Program in Union Gap in 2017. Since then, he has moved up within the Water Resources Program to his current position as the Permitting Unit Supervisor. He enjoys spending time with his wife and family and finding time to go fishing on the Yakima River and surrounding tributaries. And also, we're joined by Kelsey Collins, who is the water banking and trust water specialist for Ecology's Water Resources Program. So, with that, Chris, if you are ready to take it away.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. I will share my presentation and I'll try and make it a little bit shorter so we can all get out of here on time. So I'll be doing most of the presentation here today, but Kelsey Collins will be available for questions towards the end. And so we're going to go over kind of a water rights primer or like a water rights 101 here for the state of Washington. Um, all right. So what is a water right and do I need one? I know you guys probably heard it in the last presentation. So a water right is the ability to divert or withdraw water for a beneficial use. Um, this was first implemented in 1917 for surface water, and it stated that any new uses of surface water here in the state of Washington would require a water right. You have to go through the application process, and then it was implemented for groundwater in 1945. And so on a water right itself, it'll have an instantaneous quantity, so what you're allowed to take at any one time, an annual quantity, what you can take over the season of use. It'll have a point of diversion or a point of withdrawal, so where you're legally allowed to take the water from. It'll have a place of use, so where you're legally allowed to use the water, um, and a purpose of use, so what you can use it for, whether that be like municipal, domestic, or irrigation, and a season of use, so when you can use the water. And water rights come in a couple of different forms. People apply for a water right, so you have an application, and if approved, Ecology issues a water right permit, which then will eventually become a certificate once the water is put to beneficial use. There's also water right claims, which are an assertion of water use. And so for your guys' kind of understanding, when do I need to use a water? When do I need a water right to use water? So here in the state of Washington, any uses of surface water require a water right. So if you're wanting to pump out of like a pond, a creek, a lake, a river, anything like, or a spring, anything like that, you would be required to have either a water right permit or a certificate or a claim to use that water.
Hey, Chris, let me
Um,
just interrupt for 1 second. We are not seeing a screen if you were sharing a screen.
really?
I thought you were doing
Oh,
an introduction and then realized that we don't see your screen.
oh, sorry. Do you guys see it now?
Not yet.
Oh, I'm hitting the wrong button. Sorry.
Oh,
Now
no
you
worry.
should be able
Well,
to see.
yeah, well, our attendees are eagle-eyed here, so there we go.
Sorry.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
So my first slide was just, intro. And so um, I'll jump right back into it. And so uh, do you need a water right? Yes, for surface water use. So any uses of surface water. If you're going to be using a well, which is groundwater, it's maybe, I would say most likely, but that you will need one. And then if you're getting water from like a municipality or like a city and just trucking it into your site, in one of those tanks, no, those cities and municipalities have water rights themselves, and they're just serving you under one of those rights, so you don't need one for your project. Um, and so you realize, okay, my project needs a water right. Now what? Um, First thing I would do is look to see if the property already has a water right where you're doing your project. Number one thing I would do is talk to the landowner. See, they most likely will know if they have a water right or not. And they may be able to point you in the right direction of what, where you can get the water from and everything like that. Another source you can use our water rights search tool, which is a online GIS system that has the places of use and like points of diversion or withdrawal mapped. And so you can actually search by parcel number and it'll come up with like all the water rights where the place of use intersects with that parcel. One caveat is if your parcel is kind of a square and the place of use, it'll pick up ones that are right on the edge of it that actually are for the next property over, not yours. So make sure to read that legal description of the authorized place of use. Additionally, there's some water rights that have really large places of use. One example of this is the United States Bureau of Reclamation here in the Yakima Basin. Their water rights for storage control and flood control are for the place of use is mapped as the entire Yakima River Basin. So no matter what parcel you type in, if it's within the Yakima River Basin, it's going to pull up those water rights, and those aren't really applicable to your project. So it does take a little bit of investigation to see if those are actually right. If you do come across one and you have questions, I would say contact our Water Resources customer service line. Each of the regions has their own customer service folks that will, try and get back to you within one business day. Another thing, when you leave that message, make sure to leave, your name, phone number, and a brief, message about what you're asking about. And if you have a parcel number, please leave that because we have a more detailed GIS system that we can look at when we're looking and answering your question. And then, one of the thing about these water rights is that they have specific places of use and point of diversion. So even if there's a water right on that property, depending on where you're taking the water from, it still may require a water right change, which I'll go over in a little bit. The second option that you have available for you is the groundwater permit exemption. And so if you're using a well, you're allowed to use up to 5,000 gallons a day for domestic use, 5,000 gallons a day for commercial industrial use, the irrigation of half an acre of lawn or non-commercial garden, and stock water per project without having to get a water right. So anything above that does require a water right for groundwater. And so if you have a pretty small project, at that half acre or less, you may be able to just point to the groundwater permit exemption and just take the water from a well to use it at your project. Yeah. And then probably the ones that you'll run into more are temporary changes or new applications. And so a temporary change or in a seasonal change are two ways that you can change an attribute of a water right. So in a seasonal change, you can change the point of diversion or point of withdrawal and the place of use. So if you know somebody that has a water right nearby and you'd like to use it for your project, you can file a seasonal change with the Department of Ecology to change, the location where you're going to be putting the pump in the river to wherever you're doing it, and the place of use to where you're legally allowed to use the water to your property. But a seasonal change is only for 1 year, and for if you do a temporary change, like if you're going to need to use this water for multiple years, it might be the better way to go. And because you can do this change for multiple years, and you can also change the same things as a seasonal change, the point of diversion and place of use, but you can also change the purpose of use and season of use. And when we, just a little insight for you guys, when we review these changes, there's a few things we look at. For surface water changes, we look to make sure that it won't enlarge the water right, it won't impair any existing users from this change, and we have to do what's called a tentative determination of extent and validity. The impairment one is, as long as you're not moving it to a point where someone else who had been using water can no longer use their water, it's okay. One of the bigger things is on creeks that are more like limited in their water flow. That's where we may find a problem. The tentative determination is also kind of a sticking point. And so here in Washington State, we have what's called relinquishment. And so you can lose a water right if you don't use it for 5 years, or you only partially use it for 5 years. It can relinquish or go back to the state if there isn't a sufficient cause for non-use. We're pretty busy here in the Water Resources program, and so we're not usually actively looking for these things. But when someone comes to us with a change, we are required to do this tentative determination of extent and validity. And so that kind of opens people up, like a water right holder. It opens them up for, more scrutiny on their water right. And so that may be, can kind of be a reason that a landowner may not want to do a water right change because they don't want ecology looking at their water right unnecessarily than we normally would. And then for the last option is new applications. And so you can always apply for a new water right, but these can be challenging to approve, but there may be options that we can work with. When we issue a new water right, ecology is required to look at what's called the four-part test. We have to look if water is legally and physically available, that it won't impair any existing users, that it's for a beneficial use, and it won't be detrimental to the public interest. The beneficial use one is pretty easy. As long as you're not wasting water, it's generally considered a beneficial use. Detrimental to the public interest, when we're looking at like fish impacts and other aquatic, resources stuff and like water quality. And so I don't see your guys' types of projects kind of being in that being a problem. But and then the physical availability, as long as there's water physically available in the source, so as long as you're not asking for more than what the creek can provide, then yeah, generally that's approved. When the more difficult things are the legal availability, if there's any rules closing the basin or source to new appropriations of water. And here in the central region, we have multiple in-stream flow rules. And so these rules are for the Okanagan River, Methow, Wenatchee, and Entiat rivers. And what they did is they established a minimum flow in the main stems and some tributaries, but they also closed some tributaries to new appropriations of water. And so if you ask for a water right in those areas that are closed, the answer would be no, water's not legally available. But another option is you can also provide mitigation, which is when someone has changed a water right to in-stream flow for mitigation, they've just pretty much retired that water right, and it stays in stream. And if you can work with them to kind of be able to point to that water right to offset for your impacts, that's one way you can get past the impairment and legal availability question. We can also make things subject to the minimum in-stream flows, but there is some risk to that if the flow is not being met, which happens often in our region, in those basins, that you would not be able to use the water during that time, which may be a very the time you need to use it in that August September timeframe. And all of these processes can take a long time. Our public notice is at least like 45 days, plus there's usually a draft posting period, and depending on the complexity of the project and staffing limitations, it may take months to over a year for us to work on these things, and to approve them. So if you are thinking about this avenue for your project, definitely reach out to us early, so we can talk about it and see if it is an option for you or not. Then what if I don't get a water right and I still decide to use the water? Well, it is technically illegal to use any amount of surface water without a right, and you could be subject to enforcement action or penalties, including fines up to $5,000 per day per violation. Ecology does have some regulatory discretion on these, and we generally try to provide technical assistance, but please do not use water without a water right. All right, and then I'll go over a couple successful applications for these types of projects that we've done here in the Central region. The first one that we have is from the United States Bureau of Reclamation, or I'll say the Bureau, and it was for dust abatement and revegetation irrigation. I believe this one was for the Shockey property, which is just outside of Ellensburg. And so here the Bureau staff worked with Ecology to, kind of talked about the project, and we were able to issue them a short-term permit. So a new water right that was for a couple of years while they were, establishing that vegetation at the project site. Um, one of the difficult things here is that in the Yakima River Basin and in most of the basins in our region, the water is over appropriated. So there isn't any new water left to give out. And so if we were to give out the water, it would impair an existing user, which isn't allowed. And so luckily, the Bureau had already changed multiple water rights from what they were using them for to in-stream flow for mitigation. And so the Bureau actually holds those water rights, and they were able to point to them to say that there would not be any impairment because those water rights would offset any impacts from this new use. And so we were able to approve it. And then recently, this year, the Bureau has applied for multiple other water right permits, kind of doing the same thing, other either construction, short-term permits, or revegetation or riparian vegetation irrigation projects. And so it's ongoing, and they're still able to use it, and we're still able to approve those projects. The next one was by the Chelan Douglas Land Trust for some riparian planting up in the Entiat River. And so to the right, you can see a map provided in their application. They had a couple sites on the Entiat River where they were wanting to irrigate some plants for I think 2 to 3 years to get them established before they could, be able to survive on their own. One of the key things here is that the Entiat River is one of our in-stream flow basins. So there is a rule that any new uses can't impact or make the flow drop below a certain amount. That varies throughout the year. And so we ended up issuing them a new water right saying that, yes, you can use this water right for 3 years, but it's subject to the minimum in-stream flow on the Entiat River. And so one of the provisions in their water rights said, if the Entiat River goes below flows, which it does often during the summer months, you're not allowed to use the water. This is a risk that the project proponent would take. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to approve it without mitigation. But it was a risk they had to take because there could be a chance that during the later end of their project, they may not have water to irrigate these plants when it's the hottest time during the year. And they ended up having to push back their project a couple of times, and we ended up issuing superseding decisions twice, extending out the project. And so if your plans do change, that's okay. Just let us know and work with us early so we can deal with those, add it to the workload that we have, and issue new decisions so you can stay in compliance. And then the last example I have is a project or from a water right that the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has. They've actually changed this water right multiple times. In this project, the left screen shows the map that they provided of the original point of diversion and place of use. So here's the point of diversion. This is the place of use. And so Fish and Wildlife holds this water right to irrigate that property. I think they were using it for like the elk feeding station, but then they decided that they no longer really needed that. And they've moved it multiple times downstream towards Sunnyside for some like waterfowl habitat stuff. And then in this project, they actually worked with the Yakima Nation Fisheries Program to move it upstream on the South Fork Cowiche Creek area for a riparian planting project and habitat restoration thing that they were doing up there. And so they changed the point of diversion and the place of use upstream from where its original place of use and point of diversion was. We were able to approve this seasonal change because, we looked at it, and there would not be any impairment to existing rights in that kind of reach between where it was used and where they wanted to use it. And I think this is a good example of, working with other agencies or water right holders to meet your needs. Ecology holds some water rights that are in stream to maybe be able to help out. There's different water banks that have water rights, but then also Fish and Wildlife and DNR and the counties in our region, they hold water rights too. And so they may be able to, you may be able to work with other partners that you have to fit your needs. Sometimes it may not be approved, sometimes it might be. One interesting thing here too, I would like to note, especially if you're working with landowners, if a water right, if someone is not going to use a water right and they're worried about it relinquishing while they're not using it, they can always temporarily donate it to in-stream flow through our Trust Water Rights program. And so it's a pretty easy form. And while people donate it, temporarily donate, they can either just do it for one season or they can do it for multiple years. When they temporarily donate it, it's protected from relinquishment. So, if you're working with a landowner that, doesn't want to use their water all of the time, or, is wanting to take a hiatus or whatever, feel free to let them know about that, or tell them to contact us about the Trust Water Rights program. All right. And then last thing here, the pre-application consultation request. So Ecology highly recommends that you submit one of these requests when you're planning your project. What it is it's an online form. You can either do it paper, but now we have it online. You can submit this online form. It has like a brief description about what your project is, where you want to use it, how much water you want to use, and what you want to use it for. You submit it to Ecology online, and we try to respond to you within 5 business days to set up a meeting to talk about your project or your proposed use. And so one of our staff will review the consultation request, and at the meeting kind of give you if there's any red flags or big problems that they see, or if they have any suggestions on a possible solution forward for it. I'm the reviewer here for the Central Regional Office, so that includes Okanagan, Chelan, Douglas, Kittitas, Yakima, Benton, and Klickitat counties. So if you guys are working in any of those counties and you submit one of these pre-application and consultation requests, you'll most likely be dealing with me again. So I'll try and help you guys out and try and find a solution for you. But this is not the application. And so we do recommend that you do this early, because actually applying and getting through the whole process can be a lengthy can take a long time. And so, the last thing we want is you guys are putting plants in the ground and you need water the next week, because we just can't turn things around that quickly just because of statutory deadline or guidelines. And so, I really recommend you talk to us early for these types of things, and so we can, get you in the right path moving forward. All right, I was going to leave the rest of the time for discussion or any questions you guys had.
Thank you so much, Christopher. We do have one question in the chat that I see. And again, if there are others, please either put them in the chat or raise your hand. Corey with Ponderay, who had a question with regard to certifications. Are you considering any programs such as certification for environmental restoration organizations at the state level to expedite and improve the efficiency of these applications? Our team often spends a significant amount of time working through the approval process with Ecology, and when operating within tight grant-funded budgets, this can present challenges in maintaining efficiency. And I see Kelsey has joined us as well.
Yeah.
I've got some notes on that too, Chris. So,
Oh, you do?
yeah.
Yeah, go for it, Kelsey.
Yeah, I had the benefit of being able to read the comments while you were presenting. So I'll just take a crack at that. So the first question was, are we looking to expand our ability to assist folks in finding these water rights? Because like most people, it's challenging to get through the permitting process. It can take a lot of time. And the question also was, what is that time frame? And like almost everything we do, it really depends. So it depends on both what the permitting process is that you're needing to take to get water. So if it's you need a brand new water right for an extended length of time, that takes longer for us to process versus if you're needing just a short term authorization or a transfer. All of those have different timelines and different challenges in our different regions. And then one of the other things that we find here is that our staff are also subject to challenges with, if we're in a drought and we're required by the legislature to be processing emergency drought authorizations, that can really get in the way of our permitting time. So to piggyback what Chris was saying at the end there, he was talking about that.
Oh, I think we lost you, Kelsey. You froze. I think I'll try and answer that. Fall that pre-application, process is really important. I don't.
Uh, oh,
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 you're back now, Kelsey.
I'm in the office. Why is that happening? Do you
I
know
don't
where I
know.
stopped? I don't know where I stopped.
You said you were gonna piggyback off of what I was saying about the pre-app or something.
Yes. Okay. So I want folks to think about more broadly about their water needs and establishing a relationship with the regional office where they're going to have projects and go and have a pre-application consultation, but very broadly about what their options are to try to get water in those places. Um, and then also to think about other entities that you may brainstorm with that have experience in water access to water and where mitigation might be available and what partnerships you could piggyback from. That apparently is my word of the day. So like Trout Unlimited does a lot of work with water rights, Washington Water Trust, and then even county organizations, Chelan County Natural Resources Department, Kittitas County Public Works, who also deal with water locally. But don't wait until even waiting until you have your project locked down. Come talk to us early. Corey, I think, is from a conservation district. We, at least at Central, we work pretty closely with our conservation districts, and we've developed an understanding of kind of how we can serve water rights. And so I would suggest that he talk to the regional office more broadly to sort of establish some understandings. This is a great way to start to brainstorm about how they can be more efficient when these projects really arise. So I think that's all. Oh, one last thing, super quick while I'm blabbing. One other possibility is that if you're within a service area of an irrigation district or irrigation company, that could also be an opportunity. I think that's all my notes. See, I told you I was thinking about this while you were
Yeah.
talking.
I see there's another question. Corey said, what's the turnaround time for applying and receiving a water right? Like Kelsey said, it depends. I would say a seasonal change, if you know that it's going to happen, please get it in before, I want to say like the middle of February is what our application says. We might be able to help you out. It's difficult sometimes if it's something that we've done before multiple times, like that the water right for fish and wildlife that we've changed. It's a little bit easier process because we've dealt with that water right. And one of the more time consuming things for staff is that tentative determination of extent and validity, because we have to look back from when the certificate was issued or the last change was done. And so that could be us reviewing information, aerial photos or Landsat from the 70s up to today. And then, really looking at what's been irrigated, what's been not been irrigated. And then if there's problems, then it can kind of spiral from there. But, I would say a couple months to a year or so. It depends on your project. Generally when people ask that question for just regular applications, I would say multiple years at least.
But there can be tweaks. If we know way
Yeah.
ahead of time and we can be thinking about it, and that's why I think just getting in front of your regional office, and just talking very broadly and brainstorming about what all is possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there
No,
is one, oh, sorry, go ahead. I was
yeah, no,
gonna
that's
say there's one
definitely
more
one of the
question
big
in there.
things.
Yeah.
Could a water right be given to riparian watering if it's expected to have indirect benefits to base flow? So there's still going to be some consumptive use associated with the planting, I assume. But I think you're talking about retiming of water. And I want to say I've heard of some of that stuff kind of in like the stream flow grant world. Kelsey, do you have an answer to
Yeah,
that one?
the problem is it doesn't really trigger like a priority processing in the sense that we can, yeah, I mean, it's still such a, serving riparian plantings is still a really important environmental benefit. So it's still already a priority for us. But by, unless it's part of some broader, like grant relate, I don't know. I mean, maybe, but again, it's still us having to figure out how to process that water right, whether it's beneficial or not. So I like the idea. And again, get it out, get it in front of water resources staff as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I don't see any other hands raised or.
And you can always call one of us, Chris or I, and we can try
Yeah.
to brainstorm with you or give you the right questions to ask your other regional office or make good contacts for you. So
Yeah, we're always here to chat and, help you out.
Thank you both so much.
No problem.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. And if everybody could just join me in extending our gratitude to all of today's presenters for taking time out of their very, very busy schedules to bring us such good content today. I think I'm seeing some virtual rounds of applause. But yes, so grateful for everybody for being here. I'd also like to extend a final thank you to our 2025 sponsors for this year's symposium. As Merritt mentioned, we had to pivot to trying to make things online and accessible to everybody, and we're so grateful by getting so many wonderful donations. We're really grateful for every single one of them, and could not bring the symposium to you all without their support. So thank you again to all of our sponsors there on the screen. Today's symposium will be recorded, so just keep your eye peeled for that, and that'll be sent out in an email coming out, and that will be through the Populous newsletter, and so that leads me to the next thank you, which is to the Populous Committee, who put in a lot of effort and time into putting this event together. A special thank you to Merritt for being the puppet master, working behind the scenes to bring everybody together and do this very last minute pivot to being kind of a hybrid symposium. So thank you to Merritt and to everybody on the Populous Committee for all of your work putting this together. And then we also have some more upcoming events that Merritt's going to talk about, but I just wanted to note before people start trickling off that we do have an exit survey that I'm putting in the chat that will also go out in our email. Go ahead, Merritt.
Yes, we're very excited. One of the things that this pivot allowed us to do is sort of reimagine some things. And so you've heard from Reed Camp today. He is graciously hosting a field trip in the Palouse area. There will be more information coming out about that if you're on in our newsletters and are getting our mailings. That'll be on May 2nd. It's a Friday. And then we also are in the planning stages of a webinar with Yakima-Klickitat Fisheries Program. We are planning a webinar for sure on May 19th. We don't have the time secured yet, but then there will be a follow-up field trip in the Goldendale area on one of their project sites that they would be leading. So still in the planning stages, we'll let you know. And then June 16th, also completely secured. Mel Asher with Derby Canyon Natives will be presenting a webinar. Actually, it's going to be from 10 to 11, we think. We'd left a little bit of extra time in there. And that for sure is time certain on June 16th at 10. And then also Mel will be hosting a field trip to the Derby Canyon Natives Nursery on June 24th, the following week. So look for more information about these events. And then I'd also like to talk briefly. Washington State Conservation Commission has been a great supporter of this riparian work that we all do. Maybe you can scan their QR code or reach out to them at their website to stay in the loop. They want to be very supportive of all the work that you're doing. And then other resources. If you have things that you would like for Populace to share, please send them my way. I believe everybody has my email at this point. We'll also make sure the newsletter goes out that we'll also be asking for that information as well. And as Tori mentioned, we do have the exit survey. It's going to be very critical for us to understand exactly what content you all want and how we can bring that to you the most effectively. And anything else, Tori, to add to that?
Nope, yeah, I did put that link to the survey in the chat. And as Merritt mentioned, that will also go out in our follow-up email. And the committee does go through and review each and every one of your responses to really try and make the symposium helpful to all of you. So thank you for it's a very quick survey. It takes maybe like 10 minutes tops.
Yeah, very quick.
Yeah, so thank you so much for taking time to complete that for us.
Oh, and I will mention again, I think everybody was aware that we have recorded this and it will be up on the Yakima Basin Fish and Wildlife Recovery Board's webpage. They graciously host the Populace webpage, and so we'll have that posted. So if you missed it or anybody else missed it, it will be available in short order. So thank you. We actually ended early. I don't know if there are any questions. I'm trying to monitor the chat a little bit. People seem to be happy with content. Thank you all for spending the morning with us, and we look forward to doing other activities with you as they come forward. And oh, and there's the link to the Recovery Board webpage. Thanks, Kat. All righty.